Cold. The word meant something different now. Once, cold was the bite of Tatooine's desert night against skin, the shock of stepping from scorching sand into the rare chill that descended after the sun set. Cold was something Anakin Skywalker had felt, experienced, endured. But Darth Vader? Vader existed in a permanent state that transcended such simple sensations. The environmental systems of his suit regulated everything, filtered everything, separated him from everything. He was neither warm nor cold. He simply was. The first winter season after his transformation into Vader marked a peculiar kind of hell that few could comprehend. Coruscant's artificial climate controllers maintained perfect temperature balance across the Ecumenopolis, but even the galaxy's most advanced city planet couldn't entirely suppress the natural cycle of seasons. Winter came to the capital subtle but present. Ice crystals formed on the upper atmospheric processors. Snow fell in designated recreational zones, and across the countless levels of the planet city, beings Alba celebrated the turners of the year with traditions as diverse as the species that called Coruscant home. Vader observed it all from behind his mask, from within his prison of black armor and life support systems. The imperial palace, his new residence, rose above the city like a dark monolith. The structure had once been the Jedi Temple, that fact alone a bitter irony that Palpatine surely savored. Now it served as the Emperor's primary seat of power, and Vader maintained quarters in one of the highest towers. His chambers were austere, functional, designed not for comfort, but for survival. The meditation chamber, where he could remove his helmet and breathe unfiltered air, was the only concession to his humanity that remained. During those first winter months of the Empire, Vader would stand at the massive viewport of his quarters, looking out over the endless cityscape. Below, he could see the flickering lights of celebrations. The Empire had not yet fully suppressed the cultural traditions of its citizens. That would come later, gradually, as Palpatine tightened his grip and transformed diversity into uniformity. But in those early days, the winter festivals continued much as they had during the Republic era. The Festival of Stars, celebrated by countless human colonies, saw families gathering to exchange gifts and share meals. The Wookiee Life Day brought clans together in remembrance and joy. The Naboo Festival of Light transformed entire cities into glowing wonderlands of candles and luminescent decorations. Even the Corellian year-turn festivities, rowdy and excessive, continued in the lower levels, where imperial oversight was lighter. Vader watched these celebrations with something that might have been longing in another man. But the dark side had transformed longing into something else, something colder than any winter wind. He did not yearn for connection. He burned with resentment at the happiness of others. They celebrated life while his life had ended in fire on Mustafar. They gathered with loved ones while everyone he had ever loved was gone, dead, or believing him dead. The dichotomy between their joy and his suffering fed the darkness within him, and he welcomed it. Pain was power, isolation was strength. Yet, in the quiet hours of those winter nights, when the city below sparkled with festival lights and the sounds of distant celebration echoed even to his towering sanctuary, something stirred beneath the armor. Memories, unwelcome, unbidden, unstoppable memories of winters past. Tatooine had no true winter, but it had cold nights. Anakin remembered huddling with his mother Shmi in their small quarters in Mos Espa, the temperature dropping dramatically after the twin suns set. They had few possessions, fewer comforts, but they had each other. Shmi would tell him stories on those cold nights, tales of other worlds she had heard from the traders and travelers who passed through Watto's shop. She spoke of planets covered in snow, of ice crystals that fell from the sky like tiny stars, of festivals where people celebrated the changing seasons with fire and food and fellowship. Young Anakin had listened with wide eyes, imagining worlds so different from the desert prison of his slavery. He had dreamed of seeing snow, of feeling it melt on his skin, of experiencing winter as something more than just the absence of brutal heat. Those dreams seemed from another lifetime now. They belonged to a boy who no longer existed, who had died screaming in agony on a river of lava, but the memories persisted. The dark side could not entirely erase them, though it could twist them, warp them into weapons of psychological torment. Vader allowed himself these memories during those first winters as the Dark Lord because they fueled his anger. Every happy memory became a reminder of what had been stolen from him. Every moment of past joy transformed into present agony. He remembered the Jedi Temple during winter celebrations, back when he had been a Padawan learner. The Jedi officially maintained that they stood apart from cultural celebrations, that attachments and festivities were contrary to their code. But the temple had housed thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds, and even the most disciplined Jedi could not entirely suppress the cultural traditions ingrained from childhood. Master Yoda, despite his stern teachings about attachment, would gather the younglings during winter months and tell them stories of ancient Jedi, tales of heroism and sacrifice that held the same warmth as any cultural tradition. The temple cafeteria would feature special meals incorporating dishes from various Jedi homeworlds. Padawans would exchange small tokens of friendship, simple gifts that technically violated no rule but acknowledged the bonds between them. Anakin had cherished those moments more than he had ever admitted. As a former slave, this concept of gifts, of freely given kindness with no expectation of return, had moved him deeply. He remembered crafting small mechanical trinkets in the workshop, using spare parts and his natural affinity for technology to create presents for his friends. A miniature holographic projector for one, a self-adjusting training remote for another. Simple things, but made with care. And then there had been Padme. The memory of winters with her cut deeper than any lightsaber wound. Naboo transformed during the winter season. The planet's temperate climate meant winter brought rain more often than snow to the populated regions, but the mountains surrounding the lake country would frost with white. The capital city of Theed became a masterpiece of light and celebration during the Festival of Light, a tradition dating back millennia in Naboo culture. Vader could remember, though he tried not to, the first Festival of Light he had experienced with Padme. They had married in secret, their love forbidden by both her position as senator and his vows as a Jedi. They stole moments together whenever possible, brief encounters hidden from the galaxy. But during one winter, circumstances had aligned to give them nearly a full week together at Padme's lake retreat. The Festival of Light lasted for 5 days, celebrating the triumph of hope over despair, of illumination over darkness. Cities and homes would display intricate lanterns, each one representing a wish or dream for the coming year. The final night of the festival saw the release of sky lanterns, thousands of glowing lights rising into the darkness, carrying prayers and hopes toward the stars. Padme had decorated the lake house with traditional Naboo lanterns. Anakin could still see them in his mind's eye, delicate paper constructions painted with intricate patterns, each one illuminated from within by a small glow rod. She had explained the symbolism of each design as they hung them together. The wave pattern represented flowing forward despite obstacles. The mountain motif symbolized strength and permanence. The star design stood for guidance and destiny. They had made their own lantern together for the final night. Padme had painted it with a design of her own creation. Two stars orbiting a single sun, neither alone, bound together by forces beyond their control, but choosing to dance rather than collide. Anakin had helped construct the delicate frame, his mechanical skills ensuring it would be sturdy enough to reach the upper atmosphere before burning out. On the last night of the festival, they had stood on the balcony of the lake house, surrounded by the dark waters and distant mountains, and released their lantern into the night sky. It had risen with hundreds of others from the surrounding countryside, a constellation of artificial stars ascending into the darkness. Padme had stood pressed against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for those moments, Anakin Skywalker had experienced perfect peace. He had dared to imagine a future where such moments could be permanent. A future where he could openly love Padme, where they might have a family, where the war would end and he could leave the Jedi Order without shame. He had imagined growing old with her, celebrating the Festival of Light year after year, perhaps with children of their own, building a life of light and love in defiance of the darkness he had seen in his visions. Those dreams had died with Padme, or so he had been told. Lord Vader, standing at the viewport of the Imperial Palace, remembered being told that he had killed her in his rage. The memory was fragmented, unclear, twisted by pain and the dark side's corruption. But he remembered Palpatine's words. "It seems, in your anger, you killed her." The Emperor had delivered this information with false sympathy, and Vader had believed it, had accepted it, had allowed it to complete his transformation into the monster he had become. If Padme was dead, and dead by his hand, then Anakin Skywalker deserved to die as well. Vader had embraced that death willingly. He had buried Anakin beneath layers of anger, hatred, and suffering. He had become the thing he had feared most, the instrument of destruction that his visions had warned him about. And so the winter festivals that first year meant nothing to him except as reminders of his failure. He did not celebrate. He did not acknowledge the passage of seasons except as measurements of time in his service to the Emperor. When Palpatine required his presence at official functions, Vader attended, standing like a silent statue of death among the celebrating Imperial officers. His reputation as the Emperor's enforcer grew during these events. No one dared approach him. No one offered seasonal greetings or attempted to include him in festivities. He was apart, alone, exactly as it should be. Yet the isolation gnawed at him in ways he could not entirely suppress. The dark side fed on emotion, on passion and pain, but it could not entirely erase the fundamental human need for connection. Vader rationalized these unwelcome feelings as weakness, remnants of Anakin that must be purged. He meditated for hours, diving deep into the dark side, seeking to drown any lingering humanity in an ocean of hate. But the Force, even the dark side of the Force, has a memory of its own. The living force that permeated the galaxy retained echoes of every moment, every emotion, every connection ever made. And during winter months, when the galaxy paused to celebrate life and light and hope, those echoes grew louder. Vader could feel them when he meditated, could sense the joy of billions celebrating across thousands of worlds. It repulsed him. It infuriated him. And in moments he refused to acknowledge, it hurt him. The Emperor, ever perceptive, noticed Vader's particular struggles during these seasonal periods. Palpatine was a master manipulator, and he understood that to keep Vader as his servant, he must constantly tend to the darkness within him, preventing any light from taking root. During that first winter after Vader's creation, Palpatine summoned him to the throne room on the evening of the Festival of Light's final night. Vader had knelt before his master, the throne room vast and empty around them. Through the massive windows, the lights of Coruscant celebrations were visible, a galaxy of artificial stars mimicking the Sky Lantern's tradition of Naboo and a dozen other worlds. "You are troubled, my friend," Palpatine had said, his voice gentle, almost grandfatherly. It was a tone he used when he wanted to seem understanding, though Vader knew better than to trust it entirely. "I am not troubled, Master," Vader had responded, his vocabulary turning the words mechanical and hollow. "I am merely reflecting on the past." "Dangerous, that," Palpatine had mused. "The past is a trap, Lord Vader. It tempts us with what was, distracts us from what is, and blinds us to what could be. You stood at a crossroads once, and you chose power over sentiment. Do not allow the sentimentality of others to weaken your resolve." "Nothing will weaken my resolve, Master." "Good, good." Palpatine had risen from his throne, his twisted form moving with surprising grace as he approached. "But I sense conflict in you nonetheless. The celebrations of the week remind you of your former life, of your former attachments." Vader had remained silent. There was no point in denying what the Emperor already knew. "These feelings are natural," Palpatine had continued, circling around him like a predator. "The transition from Jedi to Sith is not complete in a single moment. The light side clings desperately, attempting to reclaim what it has lost. But you must remember, Lord Vader, that the light offers nothing but false comfort. It preaches love while forcing loneliness upon its servants. It speaks of peace while waging endless war. The Jedi stole you from your mother and forbade you from saving her. They prevented you from openly loving Padme. Their rules, their restrictions, their hypocritical code cost you everything you held dear." The words had stoked the fires of Vader's anger, exactly as Palpatine intended. The Emperor had continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "These celebrations you observe, these festivals of light and joy, they are lies, Lord Vader, temporary distractions from the harsh reality of existence. The beings below celebrate tonight, but tomorrow they will return to their struggles, their pain, their ultimate insignificance. You have transcended such illusions. You have embraced the truth that power, true power, is the only constant in this galaxy, the only thing worth pursuing." Vader had absorbed these words, allowed them to resonate with the darkness within him. The Emperor was right. He had to be right. Because if he was wrong, if there was still value in those celebrations of light and connection, then Vader's transformation had been for nothing. His suffering would be meaningless, and Vader could not accept meaninglessness. Better to embrace the darkness completely than to acknowledge that he might have chosen wrong. "I understand, Master," Vader had said. "The past is dead. I am all that remains." "Precisely," Palpatine had smiled, a terrible expression that held no warmth. "Now, I have a mission for you. Reports have reached me of a Jedi who survived Order 66. He has been seen on Jabiim, organizing resistance against our rule. I want you to find him, hunt him down, and kill him. During his execution, I want you to remember every Jedi who denied you your mother, every Jedi who forbade your love, every Jedi who claimed to serve the light while casting you into darkness." The mission had been a gift of sorts, purpose, direction, a focus for his rage that would take him far from Coruscant and its winter celebrations. Vader had bowed to his master and departed that very night. Jabiim was a world of perpetual storms and driving rain. It had no winter season in any traditional sense, only endless variations of miserable weather. The planet had sided with the Separatists during the Clone Wars, and Anakin Skywalker had fought a brutal campaign there as a Jedi general. The mission held another layer of psychological torment, returning Vader to a place where he had experienced defeat and loss as a Jedi. The hunt had taken weeks, trudging through endless mud and rain, interrogating rebels, destroying resistance cells. Vader had been methodical, patient, allowing his reputation to spread before him. He wanted the Jedi to know he was coming, wanted them to feel the fear and desperation of being hunted by an implacable predator. When he had finally cornered his prey, a Jedi Master named Louis Corda, the confrontation had been brief. The Jedi had fought well, but his light side techniques were no match for Vader's raw power and rage. As Vader had stood over the dying Jedi, rain pouring down on his black armor, he had felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion, just emptiness, just cold. He had returned to Coruscant after the winter festivals had ended. The decorations had been taken down. The celebrations had concluded. Life had returned to the ordinary rhythm of imperial business, and Vader had felt nothing about any of it. He told himself this was strength, that his lack of feeling proved his transformation was complete, that he was beyond such trivial concerns as seasons and celebrations and the turning of the year. But in his meditation chamber, when he removed his helmet in the sterile safety of his life support pod and breathed unfiltered air through ruined lungs, the memories remained. They persisted year after year, each winter bringing new torment disguised as reminiscence. The dark side used them to fuel his anger, but somewhere, buried deep beneath layers of hatred and pain, a small part of Anakin Skywalker remembered what it felt like to love winter, to anticipate the festivals, to hope for a better future. That part of him was dying, slowly suffocated by the darkness. But it was not yet entirely dead, and that fact, more than any physical pain his suit could inflict, was Vader's greatest agony during those cold winter nights when the galaxy celebrated and he stood alone. The Force moved in patterns, cycles within cycles, seasons that transcended mere planetary rotations. Winter came and went. Festivals were celebrated, and Darth Vader endured, a monument to darkness, standing watch over a galaxy that had forgotten how to fear the cold, the Empire's winter celebrations. The Galactic Empire did not celebrate. This was the official position, at least. The Emperor had declared that the strength of the Empire came from unity of purpose, not diversity of tradition. Cultural celebrations were viewed as distractions from productivity, opportunities for dissent to organize under the guise of festival gatherings, and reminders of the old republic's failed policy of pluralism. In theory, the Empire discouraged all such festivities in favor of imperial holidays commemorating military victories and the Emperor's wisdom. In practice, suppressing the cultural traditions of billions of beings across thousands of worlds proved impossible, even for the Emperor's vast apparatus of control. So the Empire adapted, as tyrannies always do. They did not eliminate the winter celebrations. They co-opted them. Darth Vader observed this transformation across the first decade of imperial rule. He watched as the Festival of Stars became Imperial Unity Day, still celebrated in winter, but now focused on loyalty to the Empire rather than cultural heritage. He saw Life Day gradually reshaped by propaganda, with public celebrations requiring imperial permits and featuring mandatory displays of the Emperor's hologram alongside traditional decorations. The Naboo Festival of Light continued, but now the lanterns were expected to include imperial symbols, and the sky lanterns required flight permits that could be revoked if local populations showed insufficient loyalty. The transformation was subtle in some regions, brutal in others. On worlds that had supported the Separatists during the Clone Wars, winter celebrations were banned entirely for the first 5 years of imperial rule. On core worlds with strong imperial support, the celebrations were encouraged but carefully monitored. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. You could celebrate, but only in ways that served the Empire. Joy was permitted only when it reinforced submission. Vader played his role in this cultural manipulation with the same cold efficiency he brought to all imperial business. He was often deployed during winter months, his imposing presence at planetary celebrations serving as a reminder that the Empire's reach extended everywhere, even into moments meant for joy and connection. He remembered one such deployment to Corellia 2 years into the Empire's reign. The Corellian Year-Turn Festival was legendary across the galaxy for its exuberance. Corellians celebrated the turning of the year with a week of feasting, drinking, racing, and general revelry that bordered on chaos. It was exactly the sort of cultural tradition the Empire wanted to suppress, but Corellia was too important industrially and politically to simply crush. Instead, the Empire had to be more subtle. Vader had arrived during the height of the celebrations, his Star Destroyer dropping out of hyperspace in the middle of the festival week. The message was intentional. You are being watched. Your celebrations are permitted only because the Empire allows them. Enjoy your festivals, but remember who grants you that privilege. He had attended the official opening ceremony of the Corellian shipyard's new construction facility, a deliberate scheduling that required local officials to abandon their celebrations and attend an imperial function. Hundreds of Corellian dignitaries, industrialists, and politicians had gathered in the massive hangar bay, their festival attire looking absurd and inappropriate in the military setting. Vader had stood on the platform beside the regional governor, a former Republic admiral named Sempton, who had enthusiastically joined the empire. The governor had given a speech about the glory of the empire and the privilege of serving it. Vader had simply stood there, silent and menacing, his breath echoing through the vocabulator in rhythmic reminder of what happened to those who defied imperial will. After the ceremony, the governor had hosted a reception. It was meant to be a fusion of imperial formality and Corellian celebration, an attempt to show that one could serve the empire and still maintain cultural identity. The result had been awkward and forced. Imperial officers in their gray uniforms stood stiffly, while Corellian guests tried to inject some festivity into the proceedings. Musicians played traditional Corellian songs, but at subdued volumes. Traditional foods were served but on formal imperial china. The whole affair had the feeling of a funeral pretending to be a party. Vader had attended because the Emperor had commanded it. Palpatine understood the power of Vader's image. The Dark Lord's presence at celebrations sent a message that transcended words. You may celebrate, but we are watching. You may laugh and drink and enjoy your traditions, but remember that your joy exists only because the Empire permits it. One gesture from Vader could end the festivities instantly. One word from him could see the organizers arrested. The unspoken threat was more effective than any speech. People had kept their distance from Vader at the reception. A circle of empty space surrounded him wherever he moved, as if his mere presence created a void that others feared to enter. Some guests had glanced at him with barely concealed fear. Others had avoided looking at him entirely. A few had studied him with expressions Vader had learned to recognize as morbid curiosity, the way one might observe a caged predator. Fascinated and repulsed in equal measure, one interaction from that evening had remained with him. A young Corellian woman, perhaps 20 standard years old, had been pushed forward by her companions. It was clearly a dare, a drunken challenge to approach the Dark Lord. She had walked toward Vader with the exaggerated confidence of someone who had been drinking, her festival attire colorful and inappropriate for the formal setting. She had stopped just outside his circle of isolation and raised her glass. "To the Empire," she had said, her voice loud enough to carry. "May it last 10,000 years." Her tone had been mocking, her words technically loyal but delivered with sardonic inflection. Her companions had watched from a distance, some amused, others horrified at her audacity. Vader had simply looked at her, saying nothing. The silence had stretched, and he had watched her drunken confidence slowly drain away as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The color had faded from her face. Her hand holding the glass had begun to tremble. Still, Vader had said nothing. He had simply held her gaze through his mask's eye lenses, allowing the fear to build. He could have killed her with a thought, could have crushed her throat with the force from across the room, could have had her arrested and executed before the night ended. Instead, he had simply turned away, dismissing her as beneath his notice. The woman had stumbled backward, nearly dropping her glass, and her companions had quickly ushered her away. The message had been delivered more effectively than any punishment could have achieved. Even at your celebrations, even during your moments of drunken rebellion, we are watching, and we could end you in an instant. The only reason you live is because we allow it. That incident had been minor, forgettable in the grand scheme of Vader's duties, but It exemplified his role during winter celebrations across the galaxy. He was the cold shadow that fell across moments of warmth, the reminder of the Empire's power that could not be escaped even during festivals, meant to bring joy. Other deployments during winter months had been less subtle. On Ryloth, 3 years into the Empire's reign, he had overseen the suppression of a traditional Twi'lek winter celebration that the Empire had deemed seditious. The Festival of Ascendance was a Twi'lek tradition celebrating the triumph of their ancestors over slavers and oppressors. In the context of imperial occupation, such a celebration carried obvious rebellious undertones. Vader had arrived with a full battalion of stormtroopers. They had surrounded the primary celebration site in the capital city of Lesu as the festival reached its climax. Vader had broadcast a message to the gathered Twi'leks, his voice amplified across the city. The celebration was illegal. The participants were in violation of imperial law. They had 1 hour to disperse or face arrest. Most had fled immediately, but a core group of several hundred had remained, defiantly continuing their celebration. They had sung traditional songs, performed ritual dances, and displayed historical banners commemorating Twi'lek heroes who had fought against oppression. It was peaceful resistance, the sort that the Jedi might once have admired. Vader had given them the full hour. Then, when the time elapsed, he had ordered the stormtroopers forward. The arrests had been brutal, but not lethal. The Empire wanted prisoners, not martyrs. The celebration's organizers were taken to imperial facilities for interrogation. The participants were processed, recorded in imperial databases, and released with warnings. The historical banners were confiscated and destroyed. Vader had watched it all from a position overlooking the celebration site. He had felt no satisfaction in crushing this expression of cultural identity. He had felt no remorse either. He simply executed his orders with mechanical efficiency, another task completed in service to the Empire. But standing there, watching stormtroopers drag away Twi'leks who had been singing and dancing moments before, Vader had experienced something unexpected. A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. He remembered being a child in Mos Espa, watching slave masters break up gatherings of enslaved beings who had dared to celebrate their own traditions. He remembered the anger he had felt seeing people punished for the simple act of finding joy in oppression. The memory had been brief, quickly suppressed, but it had rattled him. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. He had become the thing he had once hated, the enforcer of tyranny, punishing those who sought light in darkness. The dark side had offered its familiar comfort. These Twi'leks were not like the slaves of Tatooine. They were potential rebels, threats to order and stability. By crushing their celebration, he prevented future violence. By demonstrating imperial power, he saved lives that would have been lost in rebellion. The Empire brought peace, even if that peace required force to maintain. Vader had accepted these rationalizations because the alternative was unbearable. If he acknowledged that his actions were wrong, that he had become a monster, then everything he had sacrificed, Padme, the Jedi, his very humanity, had been for nothing. Better to embrace the darkness completely than to admit he had chosen wrong. Year after year, Vader carried out similar missions during winter months. He disrupted celebrations on Botha, Sullust, Mon Cala, and dozens of other worlds. Some operations were public displays of power meant to intimidate. Others were covert eliminations of celebration organizers who the empire had identified as potential rebel leaders. Each mission reinforced the same message. The empire controlled everything, even joy itself. The emperor deployed Vader this way intentionally. Palpatine understood that celebrations were when people felt most hopeful, most connected to their communities, most likely to imagine a better future. By inserting Vader into these moments, the emperor corrupted that hope. He ensured that even during festivals meant to celebrate life and light, the shadow of the empire fell across the galaxy's consciousness. For Vader personally, these deployments served another purpose. They kept him away from his own memories and emotions during the winter months. When he was actively crushing celebrations, hunting rebels, and enforcing imperial will, he had no time to reflect on his own losses. Action provided escape from thought. Duty provided refuge from emotion. But the galaxy was vast, and even Vader could not be everywhere. On worlds where his presence was not required, imperial officers carried out the work of transforming celebrations into tools of control. The methods varied, but the goal remained constant. Winter celebrations would continue, but they would serve the empire, not the people. On Chandrila, imperial governors mandated that all Festival of Stars celebrations include readings of imperial propaganda. Children exchanging gifts were required to give at least one imperial gift, officially approved toys and books that reinforced loyalty to the emperor. Families gathering for traditional meals had to display holographic images of imperial symbols in their homes, and random inspections ensured compliance. On Alderaan, Senator Bail Organa walked a careful line. The planet's traditional winter celebrations were beloved by its people, and Organa knew that allowing the empire to corrupt them would breed resentment. But he also knew that outright defiance would bring imperial wrath down on his peaceful world. So he negotiated compromises, permitted limited imperial oversight in exchange for preserving the core traditions, and quietly subverted imperial monitoring whenever possible. Vader had visited Alderaan during winter months twice in the first decade of imperial rule. Both times had been officially diplomatic visits to meet with Senator Organa on matters of policy. In reality, they were shows of force, reminders that even Alderaan's privileged position could not protect it from imperial scrutiny. During his second visit, Vader had been forced to attend a royal reception during the planet's Ceremony of Seven Stars, a traditional celebration involving elaborate displays of ice sculptures and aurora-like light projections. The ceremony celebrated the seven stars visible from Alderaan's northern hemisphere during winter months, each star representing a virtue that Alderaanian philosophy held dear: wisdom, compassion, courage, justice, hope, love, and peace. The irony of Darth Vader attending a celebration of these virtues had not been lost on anyone present. Bail Organa had hosted the reception at the royal palace, and Vader had been an honored guest in the most uncomfortable sense. People had been polite, professionally courteous, but the tension in the air had been unmistakable. Vader represented everything the Ceremony of Seven Stars stood in opposition to. He had stood in the palace's grand hall, surrounded by ice sculptures that caught and reflected the aurora lights projected through the massive windows. Each sculpture represented one of the seven virtues. The wisdom sculpture depicted a scholarly figure contemplating a book. The compassion sculpture showed a healer tending to a patient. The courage sculpture portrayed a warrior defending the innocent. Vader had studied these sculptures with something approaching contempt. These virtues were weaknesses in his view, lies the Jedi told themselves to justify their failures. Wisdom that did not lead to action was useless. Compassion that prevented necessary cruelty was dangerous. Courage without power was empty bravado. Justice was whatever the strong declared it to be. Hope was a fantasy. Love was the greatest weakness of all. And peace? Peace was a lie. There was only passion. Yet standing there, surrounded by these beautiful representations of ideals he had rejected, Vader had felt something unexpected. Not conviction that he had been right to abandon these virtues, not satisfaction in his transformation. Instead, he had felt a profound sense of loss, an ache that his mechanical body should not have been capable of experiencing. These were the values Padme had embodied. She had possessed genuine wisdom, had shown compassion even to enemies, had demonstrated courage in the face of impossible odds, had fought for justice throughout her career, had maintained hope even in the darkest times, and had loved him despite everything. She had sought peace not as an escape from conflict, but as the ultimate goal worth fighting for. Vader had destroyed all of that, or thought he had. The memory of killing her, of choking the life from her in his rage, remained fragmented and unclear. But whether he had killed her directly or his actions had led to her death, the result was the same. The woman who had embodied these 7 virtues was gone, and he was responsible. The reception had continued around him, but Vader had remained fixated on the sculptures, particularly the one representing love. It depicted 2 figures, their hands joined, their forms leaning toward each other in perfect balance. It was abstract enough to represent any form of love, familial, romantic, platonic. But to Vader, it could only represent one thing, the love he had shared with Padme and then destroyed. Bail Organa had approached him during this moment of reflection. The senator was a careful man, skilled in diplomacy, and he had sensed something in Vader's stillness that prompted him to take a risk. The ceremony of 7 stars is one of our oldest traditions, Organa had said, standing beside Vader and looking at the sculptures. We believe these virtues are not separate qualities, but interconnected. You cannot have true wisdom without compassion. You cannot demonstrate courage without justice. And all of them flow from and return to love, which is the source and destination of meaning in our philosophy. Vader had not responded immediately. When he did speak, his words carried a warning edge. Philosophy is a luxury, Senator. Reality requires strength. Strength without virtue is merely power, Organa had replied, his voice measured but firm. And power without purpose inevitably destroys itself. It was as close to criticism of the Empire as Organa could safely venture. Vader had turned to look at him, and Organa had held his gaze with the courage of a man who knew he was risking death, but believed his words were worth that risk. You speak dangerously, Senator, Vader had said, the threat implicit in his tone. I speak of Alderaanian philosophy, Lord Vader. Surely the Empire does not suppress philosophical discussion. A challenge, cleverly disguised as innocent academic discourse. Vader could have pressed the issue, could have found cause for arrest or at least intimidation. Instead, he had simply turned away, returning his attention to the ice sculptures. Alderaan may maintain its traditions for now, Vader had said, but do not mistake the Empire's patience for weakness. These virtues you celebrate exist because the Empire provides the peace and order that makes them possible. It was a lie, and both men knew it. But it was the sort of lie that allowed the conversation to end without violence. Organa had bowed slightly and withdrawn, understanding that he had pushed as far as safety allowed. That evening, on Alderaan had stayed with Vader in the years that followed. It represented something he encountered occasionally during his enforcement of imperial will over winter celebrations. Some people, in some places, maintained their traditions with genuine conviction, not as empty rituals, but as living expressions of values they truly believed in. These individuals were the most dangerous to the Empire because they could not be co-opted. They would rather die than allow their traditions to become tools of oppression. The Empire dealt with such people in various ways. Some were arrested, their resistance ending in imperial detention centers. Some were assassinated, their deaths made to look like accidents or attributed to rebels. Some were allowed to live but carefully monitored, their communications intercepted, their associations tracked, waiting for them to make a mistake the Empire could exploit. Vader had participated in all of these approaches over the years. He had arrested celebration organizers who refused to include imperial propaganda. He had hunted down cultural leaders who used winter festivals to spread subtle messages of resistance. He had stood in the shadows of celebrations that the Empire permitted to continue, his mere presence enough to corrupt the joy they were meant to provide. But through it all, through every crushed celebration and co-opted tradition, through every winter festival transformed into an imperial propaganda event, Vader carried the memories of genuine celebrations from his past. He remembered Padme's joy during the Festival of Light. He remembered Master Yoda's warmth during winter gatherings at the temple. He remembered his mother's stories of celebrations on worlds she had never seen but dreamed of experiencing. These memories served the dark side well. They fueled his anger at what had been taken from him, his resentment toward those who still possessed what he had lost, his hatred toward a galaxy that continued to celebrate while he suffered. But they also served as a constant reminder that he had once been capable of joy, of connection, of love, and that reminder was perhaps his greatest torture. The Empire's winter celebrations, artificial and corrupt as they were, went on year after year. The galaxy adapted as it always did, finding ways to preserve small kernels of genuine tradition within the shell of imperial control. And Darth Vader stood watch over it all, the cold enforcer of a cold empire, his presence a winter that never ended, frost that never thawed. The dark side promised power, but it could not entirely erase memory. It offered strength, but not peace. And so Vader endured, caught between the darkness he had chosen and the light he could never fully extinguish. A being of contradiction and suffering who spread that suffering across the galaxy with every winter celebration he destroyed or corrupted. The Force moved in cycles, but Vader had trapped himself in eternal winter, a season of cold and darkness from which he believed there could be no spring. Hoth, the frozen hunt. Ice stretched to the horizon in every direction, a white wasteland broken only by towering formations of frozen water and the occasional dark shadow of exposed rock. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost alive, carrying crystals of ice that would flay exposed flesh from bone in minutes. The temperature remained well below freezing even at the equator, and at the poles it dropped to levels that could freeze most atmospheric gases solid. This was Hoth, a planet that existed as a monument to cold, a world where winter never ended and nothing warmed. And it was here that Darth Vader would conduct his most significant winter operation, the hunt that would define his reputation as an implacable predator who pursued his enemies across any terrain, through any conditions, without mercy or hesitation. The hunt for the Rebel Alliance base on Hoth began months before Vader set foot on the frozen planet. The rebellion had scattered after the Battle of Yavin, their forces dispersed across the Outer Rim and beyond. The destruction of the Death Star had been a psychological victory for the rebels, proof that the Empire could be hurt. But it had also made them a priority target. The Emperor wanted them crushed completely, their remaining forces eliminated, their leadership captured or killed. Vader had taken personal command of Death Squadron, a fleet of star destroyers tasked with hunting down the rebels wherever they hid. He had deployed thousands of probe droids across the galaxy, mechanical hunters programmed to search for signs of rebel activity. Most reported nothing, their sensors finding only empty planets or civilian settlements with no military presence. But one probe droid, designated Viper 725, had transmitted interesting data from the Hoth system before being destroyed. The transmissions showed energy readings consistent with a shield generator, power outputs suggesting a significant military installation, and signs of recent construction in the planet's northern regions. It was exactly the sort of profile that matched a rebel base. Some of Vader's officers had been skeptical. Hoth was a terrible location for a base, its climate hostile, its resources minimal. Why would the rebels choose such a punishing world? But Vader had understood immediately. They chose it precisely because it was so inhospitable. Most imperial search patterns focused on habitable worlds. The rebels gained security through suffering, hiding in places where no one would think to look because no one would want to be there. The decision to investigate Hoth personally was Vader's. He could have sent subordinates, but he had learned that anything important enough to be done right was important enough for him to oversee directly. Besides, something drew him to the hunt. Perhaps it was the Force guiding him. Perhaps it was simply his need to personally confront those who defied the Empire. Whatever the reason, he chose to lead the assault himself. The journey to Hoth took Death Squadron out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Standard procedure would have been to emerge closer to the planet, but Vader had opted for a more distant arrival point. The Executor, his massive Superstar Destroyer flagship, led the formation with 5 Imperial-class Star Destroyers in support. The fleet moved toward Hoth at sublight speeds, giving the rebels time to detect their arrival. This was intentional. Vader wanted them to know he was coming. He wanted them to feel the dread of inevitable doom approaching. More practically, he wanted them to activate their shield generator. If they simply abandoned the base before he arrived, the operation would yield little intelligence and no prisoners. But if they believed they could hold against him, if they committed to defending their position, then Vader would crush them and capture valuable intelligence in the process. Admiral Ozzel, in command of the conventional fleet operations, had protested this approach. "Lord Vader, we're coming out of hyperspace too far from the system. They'll detect our approach and activate their shield before we can commence bombardment. We should emerge closer, strike before they can prepare." Vader had not appreciated the criticism. "Admiral, you presume to instruct me on tactics? The rebels will activate their shield regardless of our approach vector. This way, we control the terms of engagement. We arrive in strength, we deploy ground forces, and we demonstrate that their defenses are meaningless against imperial power. But my lord, if they activate the shield, we cannot bombard from orbit. We'll have to commit to a ground assault, which will result in higher imperial casualties and give them time to evacuate their leadership." Admiral Ozzel had been a competent officer by conventional standards, but he lacked imagination and understanding of psychological warfare. Vader's patience with such limitations was minimal. "The shield will be down in time for our bombardment, Admiral. See to your duties and leave strategic considerations to those capable of understanding them." The Admiral had bristled at the insult, but knew better than to push further. As events would unfold, his concerns would prove partially valid, but his failure to trust Vader's instincts would prove fatal to him personally. As Death Squadron approached Hoth, Vader had stood on the bridge of the Executor, watching through the massive viewports as the ice planet grew larger. The world appeared lifeless from space, a white sphere marred only by occasional blue patches where the ice was thin enough to reveal frozen ocean beneath. No green continents, no brown deserts, just endless white, a blank canvas upon which he would paint another imperial victory. The rebels activated their shield as expected, a blue shimmer that formed a protective dome over their base location. The shield would block orbital bombardment, but it was permeable to slow-moving objects. That meant ground forces could penetrate through established entry corridors, but starfighters and troop transports would be vulnerable during deployment. Vader had prepared for this. He ordered the launch of AT-AT walkers, massive four-legged assault vehicles designed for exactly this sort of operation. Their thick armor could withstand most ground-based weapons, and their height gave them commanding fields of fire over defensive positions. A full complement of snowtroopers would deploy alongside the walkers, Imperial soldiers equipped with environmental gear rated for Hoth's extreme cold. The assault began at local dawn, the sun barely cresting the horizon and providing minimal warmth. Vader had remained on the Executor initially, coordinating the attack from the bridge while his ground forces established their beachhead. He watched through real-time tactical displays as AT-ATs advanced across the frozen plains toward the rebel base, their massive legs crushing ice beneath them with each thunderous step. The rebels had fortified well. They had established trenches and gun emplacements using the ice itself as construction material. They deployed troops in white uniforms that provided excellent camouflage against the snow, and they had something unexpected: modified air speeders equipped with harpoons and tow cables, lightweight craft that used the harsh winds of Hoth to their advantage. The Battle of Hoth unfolded with a violence that turned the white landscape red with blood and black with carbon scoring from blastifier. The rebels fought with the desperation of those who knew defeat meant death. The Imperials advanced with the confidence of overwhelming force. And in the frozen wastes between them, soldiers on both sides experienced what it meant to wage war in winter's most extreme manifestation. Vader had watched one of his AT-ATs fall, brought down by a snowspeeder's tow cable wrapped around its legs. The massive walker had toppled with surprising grace, its forward momentum carrying it into a slide across the ice before it crashed into an ice formation and exploded. Dozens of snowtroopers had died in that explosion, their screams lost in the roar of the blast and the howling wind. The rebels had celebrated that kill, their gunners targeting the downed walker's remains to ensure no survivors emerged. Vader had felt their triumph through the Force, a burst of hope and defiance that momentarily warmed them against the cold. But he had also felt their underlying fear. They knew they could not win this battle. Every walker they destroyed was replaced by two more. Every rebel that fell could not be replaced at all. They were buying time, nothing more. General Maximilian Veers, commanding the ground assault from the lead AT-AT designated Blizzard 1, had pressed the attack with admirable efficiency. The walkers advanced in formation, their synchronized fire destroying rebel emplacements one by one. Snowtroopers followed behind the walkers, using them as mobile cover while they cleared trenches and eliminated pockets of resistance. The shield generator was the primary objective. Once it fell, Vader could begin orbital bombardment and ensure nothing escaped. Veers had concentrated his forces on the generator's location, identified by Imperial intelligence as the prominent structure with the largest power signature. AT fire had pounded the installation mercilessly, heavy blaster cannons designed to pierce starship armor, making short work of fortified positions meant to withstand ground weapons. When the shield generator finally fell, exploding in a fireball that sent shards of ice flying hundreds of meters, Vader had felt satisfaction. The rebels' primary defense was down. Now came the part of the operation he had anticipated most eagerly, the pursuit. Because while the ground battle raged, the rebels had been evacuating their base. Transport ships had been launching through the shield's corridors, escaping into space under cover of their defensive operations. The rebel strategy had been sound. Delay the ground assault long enough to evacuate personnel and critical supplies, then abandon the base to Imperial occupation, accept tactical defeat to preserve strategic capability. Vader had anticipated this as well. He had positioned his fleet to intercept the transports, and several had been destroyed or captured. But too many had escaped through the Imperial blockade, their hyperdrives engaging before pursuit craft could disable them. This failure had been Admiral Ozzel's responsibility, and Vader's patience with the man's incompetence had finally expired. "Admiral Ozzel," Vader had said, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the bridge, "come here." The Admiral had approached, perhaps sensing his doom but unable to refuse the summons. He had stopped before Vader, maintaining what he probably thought was professional composure, despite the fear radiating from him like heat. "You have failed me for the last time, Admiral," Vader had said. Then, without further conversation, he had raised his hand and begun to crush Ozzel's throat with the Force. The Admiral had clawed at his neck, his face turning purple as invisible pressure closed his windpipe. His eyes had bulged, his body convulsing, and then he had collapsed to the deck, dead. Vader had stepped over the corpse without a glance and promoted Captain Piet to Admiral on the spot, making clear what happened to those who disappointed him. The demonstration had served its purpose. The bridge crew had worked with renewed intensity. Nobody wanted to join Ossel on the deck, and Vader had turned his attention to the next phase of the operation, personally hunting down those rebels who had not yet escaped. He had taken a shuttle down to the planet's surface, landing near the captured rebel base as snow troopers established a perimeter. The cold hit him immediately, even through his suit's environmental controls. Hoth's temperature was low enough that his suit's heating systems had to work at near maximum capacity to maintain viable internal conditions. The cold did not bother him in a conventional sense. His burned and damaged body had long since lost most ability to feel temperature extremes, but it affected his suit's efficiency, requiring more power for heating that could otherwise be used for other systems. The wind was worse than the cold. It blew constantly, driving ice crystals that pinged against his armor like microscopic projectiles. Visibility was poor. The combination of blowing snow and the natural white of the landscape creating a disorienting environment where depth perception became unreliable. Vader had to rely more heavily on the Force to navigate, using his supernatural senses to complement his suit's sensor array. The rebel base was a warren of ice tunnels and caverns, carved from the frozen planet with industrial equipment. The rebels had fled in such haste that they had left behind supplies, equipment, and intelligence data. Snow troopers were methodically sweeping the facility, cataloging everything of value and searching for any rebels who had been left behind. Vader had walked through these ice corridors, his breath echoing in the silence left by the departed rebels. The base still held heat from its recent occupation, the ice walls weeping water where warmth met frozen surface. Emergency lighting strips provided dim illumination, casting strange shadows that moved as Vader passed. He had found evidence of their lives in these tunnels, common areas where they had gathered to eat and socialize, sleeping quarters where personal effects had been abandoned in the rush to evacuate, medical bays where wounded had been treated before being loaded onto transports. It was a glimpse into the daily existence of those who opposed the Empire, and what struck Vader was how ordinary it all seemed. These were not monsters or fanatics. They were soldiers and support personnel, people who had chosen rebellion for reasons as varied as the galaxy itself. Some had lost family to imperial violence. Some believed in the dream of restoring the Republic. Some simply opposed tyranny on principle. They lived, worked, hoped, and feared just as imperial personnel did. The only difference was the cause they served. Vader had allowed himself no sympathy. Rebels were enemies of order and stability. Their motivations were irrelevant. Their humanity was irrelevant. They had chosen to oppose the Empire, and that choice defined them completely. If they died in pursuit of their rebellion, it was a consequence they had accepted when they took up arms against imperial authority. But standing in those abandoned corridors, surrounded by evidence of lives lived and now scattered, Vader had felt something he did not want to acknowledge. Not quite regret, not quite sympathy, but a recognition of commonality, an understanding that in different circumstances he might have known these people, might have fought alongside them instead of hunting them. The thought had been brief, quickly buried beneath layers of dark side conditioning and rationalization. The past was meaningless. Alternative futures were fantasies. Only the present mattered, and in the present he was Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, enforcer of imperial will. These rebels were his prey, and he would hunt them without mercy. One group of rebels had not made it to the transports. A squad of soldiers had been cut off during the evacuation, trapped in the outer perimeter when the shield fell. They had tried to flee on foot across the frozen wastes, heading for a rendezvous point where they hoped transport might still be waiting. Vader had sensed them through the Force, their fear and determination bright against the cold emptiness of Hoth's barren landscape. He had taken a patrol of snowtroopers and pursued, following their tracks across the ice. The hunt had taken hours. The rebels had been well trained and disciplined, using every tactical advantage the terrain offered. They had split into smaller groups to make tracking difficult. They had used ice formations to break their trail. They had set traps, rigging abandoned equipment to explode when disturbed, but none of it had mattered. Vader was patient, methodical, and aided by senses that transcended normal tracking methods. One by one, the rebel groups were found and eliminated. Some surrendered, hoping for mercy that would not come. Others fought to the last, their blasters and thermal detonators useless against Vader's power. The ice ran red with blood, quickly freezing solid in the extreme cold, creating crimson stains that would remain until Hoth's next volcanic period melted the surface in millions of years. The last rebel to fall had been a young lieutenant, a woman who had fought with courage that Vader might have respected in other circumstances. She had led her squad with tactical skill, managing to evade pursuit longer than any of the other groups. But in the end, she had run out of terrain to use, out of tricks to employ, out of time. Vader had cornered her and her remaining 2 soldiers in an ice canyon, walls of frozen water rising on 3 sides, only one exit available. They had known they were trapped, had known they were going to die, but they had not surrendered. "Stand down," Vader had commanded, his voice amplified by his suit to carry over the wind. "You have nowhere to run. Surrender and live." The lieutenant had raised her blaster rifle instead. "We'd rather die standing than live kneeling." Her soldiers had echoed her defiance, training their weapons on Vader despite the futility. And in that moment, Vader had seen himself reflected in them, not as he was, but as he had been. Anakin Skywalker had said similar words once, had chosen death before submission. The difference was that Anakin had been forced to submit anyway, had been broken and remade into Vader against his will, or had he? The line between choice and coercion had blurred over the years, and Vader was no longer certain which had dominated. The thought had angered him. These rebels thought they understood sacrifice, thought their defiance meant something. They knew nothing of the prices he had paid, the sacrifices he had made. Their courage was empty bravado, worth nothing against the reality of power. Vader had killed them with the Force, reaching out and crushing their hearts simultaneously. No pain, no struggle, just cessation. They had collapsed into the snow, their defiance ending as all defiance eventually ended, in death and silence. Standing over their bodies, wind howling around him, ice crystals stinging against his armor, Vader had felt the weight of Hoth's cold more heavily than any temperature could explain. This planet, This frozen wasteland seemed to him a physical manifestation of what he had become: cold, barren, hostile to life, beautiful in a terrible way, but devoid of warmth, incapable of sustaining anything but the harshest existence. He had hunted rebels across this ice, and he had won. The Empire had crushed the rebellion's main base, scattered their forces, and demonstrated once again that there was nowhere they could hide that imperial power could not reach. It was a victory by any measure. But Hoth had also been something else. It had been a mirror held up to Vader's nature, reflecting back what he had become: a creature of cold and darkness, death incarnate walking across frozen wastes, leaving only corpses and sorrow in his wake. He destroyed without creation, conquered without building, ruled without leading. He was the Emperor's monster, the galaxy's nightmare, the final hunter who never stopped, never showed mercy, never felt warmth. The Battle of Hoth entered Imperial records as a complete success, and Vader's role in it became legend. Across the Empire, military academies taught the campaign as an example of combined arms warfare executed with ruthless efficiency. The pursuit and elimination of surviving rebel forces became a textbook case in counterinsurgency operations. Vader's personal involvement was held up as proof that the highest levels of Imperial command were willing to lead from the front when victory demanded it. But Vader remembered Hoth differently. He remembered it as the place where winter had become literal, where the cold he carried inside himself had found external form in a planet-wide deep freeze. He remembered the blood on ice, the rebels who had died defending an undefendable position, the faces of those he had killed personally. And he remembered standing in an ice canyon, looking at corpses frozen in their final defiant poses and feeling colder inside than any planet could make him feel outside. The Force connected all things, and places of great violence retained echoes of what had transpired there. Hoth would remember this battle. The ice would hold the memory of bloodshed in its crystalline structure. And somewhere deep in the Force, beyond physical death, those who had fallen here would remain, their presence a whisper that sensitive beings might detect when they stood where violence had been done. Vader did not believe in hauntings in any conventional sense, but he knew that places and events left marks on the Force, and those marks endured. Hoth would always be a battlefield, and he would always be the monster who had hunted rebels across its frozen surface, teaching the galaxy that even on the coldest, most remote, most inhospitable world, the Empire's reach was absolute and its enforcer was relentless. Winter on Hoth never ended. For Vader, winter had never ended either. He had become the ice and the snow, the frozen wasteland that killed anything trying to survive within it. And he had embraced that identity completely, because the alternative, admitting he might still be capable of warmth, was too painful to consider. Memories of Padme. During winter, the mind has a cruelty all its own. It waits for quiet moments, for times when defenses are lowered, and then it strikes with memories that cut deeper than any blade. For Darth Vader, these moments came most often during winter months, when the galaxy's celebrations of light and warmth created contrast against the darkness he inhabited. And of all the memories that haunted him, none cut as deeply as those of Padme Amidala during the winter seasons they had shared. The meditation chamber aboard the Executor was Vader's only refuge from his suit, The hyperbaric pressure pod allowed him to remove his helmet and breathe without mechanical assistance, sitting in concentrated atmosphere that supported his damaged lungs. These were the only moments he could experience anything approaching natural sensation, though natural was relative for a body as ravaged as his had become. He sat in meditation during one winter season, 3 years after the Battle of Hoth, and allowed himself to remember. The dark side fed on emotion, and memory was emotion crystallized. To truly serve the dark side, he could not entirely suppress his past. He had to acknowledge it, feel the pain of it, and transform that pain into power. This was the justification he gave himself for these sessions, though somewhere beneath the rationalization, he knew he remembered simply because he could not stop himself. Naboo in winter was paradise compared to most worlds. The planet's climate was temperate year-round, but winter brought changes subtle and beautiful. The grasslands turned golden, the forests lost some of their leaves, and the lakes reflected skies that seemed deeper blue in the cooler air. But most significantly, winter brought the festival of light, and with it, memories that even the dark side could not fully corrupt. Vader remembered the first time Padme had invited him to her family's lake house during the festival season. They had married in secret shortly after the Battle of Geonosis, and their stolen time together was precious and rare. Most of their meetings had been brief encounters on Coruscant, hidden rendezvous where discovery meant the end of both their careers. But through careful manipulation of Senate schedules and military deployments, they had managed to arrange for Anakin to have leave during the Festival of Light, and Padme had extended the invitation. Come to Naboo, celebrate the festival with her, experience winter as her people knew it. Anakin Skywalker had been nervous in a way that Jedi training could not address. He was comfortable in combat, confident in his Force abilities, skilled as a pilot and warrior, but facing Padme's family in their home environment, trying to act naturally when everything about their relationship was a secret, that terrified him in ways the Separatist army never could. The lake house was a modest structure by Naboo standards, though it would have been palatial on most worlds. It sat on the shores of a mountain lake, surrounded by forests that turned crimson and gold in the winter season. The architecture followed traditional Naboo design, all flowing curves and integration with the natural environment. Large windows looked out over the water, and the interior was warm and welcoming, decorated with the accumulated treasures of Padme's family history. Padme's father, Ruwe, had greeted Anakin with careful courtesy. Her mother, Jobal, had been warmer but watchful. Her sister Sola had been present with her daughters, Rio and Pooja, who were young and curious about the Jedi who had come to visit their famous aunt. Anakin remembered feeling like an imposter at that first dinner. He was playing a role, Jedi Knight and friend of their daughter, when the truth was so much more complicated. He had sat at their table, making conversation about the war and the Senate, while under the table his hand had found Padme's, their fingers intertwining in secret connection. The Festival of Light preparations had consumed the household over the following days. Jobal had shown Anakin how to construct the traditional lanterns, patiently teaching him to fold and cut the delicate paper, explaining the meanings of different patterns and colors. Rui had involved him in setting up the outdoor displays, stringing lights through the trees surrounding the house, creating a gentle glow that would welcome the spirits of ancestors, according to Naboo tradition. The nieces had attached themselves to Anakin immediately. To them, he was a Jedi, a figure from stories and holovids, and they peppered him with questions about lightsabers and the Force and distant planets. Anakin had found himself telling them edited versions of his adventures, leaving out the horror and emphasizing the heroism, giving them the fairy tale version of war that children needed. Padme had watched these interactions with the expression Anakin had learned to recognize as love mixed with sadness. She was imagining a future that could never be, he had realized. Seeing him with her nieces, she was dreaming of children of their own, a family they could never openly have. The Jedi Code forbade such attachments, and her position as senator made scandal unthinkable. The knowledge had hurt them both, but they had stolen that week anyway, pretending to be something they could not publicly be, and cherishing every moment of the illusion. On the final night of the Festival of Light, the traditional Sky Lantern release, Padme and Anakin had walked together through the forest paths around the lake. The trees had been illuminated with thousands of small lights, creating a canopy of artificial stars. Other families were visible on the paths and through the windows of distant houses, everyone preparing for the ceremony that would culminate the festival. "I wish we could do this every year," Padme had said, her voice quiet, meant only for him. "I wish this could be our life." "So do I," Anakin had replied, and meant it with every part of himself. "But we chose different paths before we found each other. We can't abandon those responsibilities just because they make our lives complicated." "I'm not asking you to leave the Jedi, Anakin, and I won't abandon the Senate, but surely there has to be a way. Other Jedi have left the Order, other senators have retired. When the war ends..." "When the war ends," Anakin had interrupted gently, "we'll find a way. I promise you, Padme, we'll have the life you're dreaming of, a real home, a family, all of it." It was a promise he could not have kept, even if he had remained a Jedi. The path he was on led not to domestic happiness, but to darkness and horror. But in that moment, walking through illuminated forest paths with the woman he loved, Anakin Skywalker had believed his own words, had believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that the Force itself would conspire to give them the future they deserved. The Sky Lantern release had been beautiful in a way that transcended physical description. Thousands of lanterns had risen simultaneously from all around the lake, creating a second galaxy of lights ascending into the night. Each lantern carried hopes and dreams, prayers and wishes. The Naboo believed these lanterns reached beyond the physical world, carrying messages to ancestors and spirits who watched over the living. Anakin and Padme had released their lantern together, the one she had painted with 2 stars orbiting a sun. They had watched it rise with the others, joining the ascending constellation, and Anakin had made a silent wish: keep her safe, let her live and be happy, even if I cannot be part of that happiness. Keep her safe. The memory of that moment was excruciating now, because not only had Anakin failed to keep Padme safe, but according to the Emperor, he had killed her himself. The wish, the promise, the dream of a shared future, all of it had ended in violence and death. The 2 stars orbiting together had collided after all, and both had been destroyed in the impact. Vader sat in his meditation chamber, the memory playing out in his mind with perfect clarity. The dark side sharpened memory, made it more vivid and painful. He could see Padme's face illuminated by lantern light, could hear her voice speaking of hope and future, could feel her hand in his, warm and alive and trusting. And then the memory shifted, corrupted by the dark side, into nightmare. Padme's face became pale, lifeless. Her voice choked off. Her hand went limp. And Anakin became Vader, standing over her corpse on Mustafar, her death his doing, his last connection to light extinguished by his own actions. The pain of this memory was immense, overwhelming. It should have destroyed him, should have broken his mind completely. But Vader had learned to transform pain into power, to use suffering as fuel for the dark side. The agony of remembering Padme became anger at the galaxy that had forced him to choose between love and duty, became hatred toward the Jedi who had demanded he suppress his humanity, became rage at himself for not being strong enough to save her. And from that rage came power. Dark side energy flowed through him, crackling across his meditation chamber like visible lightning. The Force itself responded to his anguish, and for moments he touched levels of power that even the Emperor might fear. In these moments, Vader was unstoppable, a living conduit for darkness so concentrated it could shatter reality. But power without purpose was merely destruction. And despite his transformation, despite years of service to the dark side, Vader still clung to one purpose that had never entirely faded: punish those responsible for Padme's death. The problem was determining who truly bore that responsibility. The Emperor said Vader himself had killed her. This seemed most likely, given what Vader remembered of Mustafar. He had force-choked her in rage after she had refused to support his vision for the galaxy. But his memories were fragmented, unclear. Had he actually killed her? Or had she merely been injured, dying later from wounds or from loss of will after learning what he had become? Sometimes Vader blamed Obi-Wan Kenobi. His former master had turned Padme against him, had brought her to Mustafar, had fought him and left him to burn. If Kenobi had not interfered, perhaps Padme would have survived. Perhaps the medical droids could have saved her. Perhaps she would have eventually understood and forgiven. Sometimes he blamed the Jedi Order itself. Their code had forced him to hide his love. Their rules had prevented him from being the husband and father he wanted to be. Their restrictions had driven him to seek power elsewhere, to listen to Palpatine's promises of a way to save Padme from the death he had foreseen in visions. The Jedi had created the conditions that led to his fall, even if they had not pushed him directly. Sometimes, in moments of brutal honesty, he blamed himself. Not Darth Vader, but Anakin Skywalker. The man he had been had made choices that led inevitably to destruction. He had allowed fear to control him, had allowed arrogance to blind him, had allowed passion to override wisdom. Anakin Skywalker had killed Padme Amidala as surely as if he had ignited a lightsaber through her heart. But assigning blame accomplished nothing. Padme was dead. The life they might have shared was impossible. The dreams they had dreamed together had become nightmares, and Vader endured, imprisoned in his suit, serving an emperor he hated, enforcing order across a galaxy he had helped enslave. The Festival of Light continued on Naboo, even under imperial rule. The empire had learned not to suppress cultural traditions too completely, recognizing that allowing controlled celebration reduced the risk of rebellion. So the Naboo still released their sky lanterns each winter, still lit their forests with traditional displays, still gathered with family to honor ancestors and dream of the future. Vader knew this because imperial intelligence reported on all planetary celebrations, looking for signs of sedition or organized resistance. He received these reports and read them with the detachment expected of an imperial enforcer. But sometimes, buried in dry intelligence language, he would find references to the Festival of Light, and the memories would surge despite his best efforts to suppress them. He wondered if Padme's family still celebrated, if Sola's daughters, grown now, released lanterns carrying wishes for their famous aunt who had died in the transition to empire, if Rui and Jobel lit candles in memory of their daughter, mourning a loss that Vader's own actions had caused. The torture of these thoughts was exquisite. The dark side transformed emotional pain into power, but some pain was so deep it transcended transformation. It simply hurt endlessly, a wound that never healed because Vader would not allow it to heal. He picked at the psychological scab constantly, keeping the wound fresh because the alternative was to let go, to move on, to accept that Padme was gone and he would never have the life they had dreamed of together. And Vader could not let go, would not let go. Holding on to the memory of Padme, even when those memories were agony, was the last connection he had to his humanity. If he released that pain, if he truly moved beyond his love for her, then Anakin Skywalker would be completely dead. And if Anakin was completely dead, then Padme had died for nothing. Her love had meant nothing. Their secret marriage had been meaningless. The promises they had made to each other had been empty words. Vader needed to believe that Padme's love had meant something, that their time together had mattered, that somewhere in the wreckage of his transformation, some small part of the man she had loved still existed, even if only as a ghost screaming in the prison of his own mind. So he remembered. He allowed himself these moments of meditation, these sessions of deliberate memory and emotional torture. He sat in his chamber and relived winters with Padme, knowing each memory would end in pain, seeking that pain because it proved he was still capable of feeling something beyond anger and hatred. The Emperor, if he knew of these sessions, would likely approve. He would see them as Vader tending to his connection with the dark side, feeding his hatred and rage with memories of loss. Palpatine would not understand, or perhaps would not care, that these memories also preserved something of Anakin Skywalker, that by remembering Padme with love, even twisted and corrupted by darkness, Vader maintained a connection to light he could never fully sever. This was Vader's secret rebellion, not against the Empire, not against his master, but against his own transformation, by refusing to completely let go of Padme, by holding on to memories that brought pain, but also proved he had once been capable of love. Vader kept alive the possibility that redemption might exist. Not redemption in any traditional sense. He had fallen too far, done too much evil, caused too much suffering for any conventional forgiveness. But perhaps redemption as a return to himself, a reclamation of humanity that darkness could never completely extinguish. Winter months were when this secret rebellion burned brightest, The galaxy celebrated light and hope and connection, everything Vader had lost. And in response, he remembered a time when he had possessed those things, when Anakin Skywalker had walked through illuminated forests with Padme Amidala, releasing lanterns into the night sky, promising a future that would never come. The memories were all he had left of her, and so he treasured them, even as they destroyed him piece by piece, year after year, winter after endless winter. The Executor's silent nights. The Executor, Vader's flagship, was a monument to imperial power. At 19,000 meters in length, the Superstar Destroyer dwarfed even the largest Imperial-class star destroyers. It carried a complement of over 200,000 personnel, naval officers, stormtroopers, pilots, technicians, and support staff. It was a city in space, a self-contained civilization capable of functioning independently for months or even years. And it was, in its way, one of the loneliest places in the galaxy for the being who commanded it. Winter aboard a starship meant nothing in conventional terms. The life support systems maintained consistent temperature and environment regardless of external conditions or the seasons of distant planets. Time was measured in ship's chronology, synchronized to Coruscant standard for convenience, but bearing no relation to natural cycles. Day and night were artificial constructs, lighting levels adjusted on a schedule designed for human circadian rhythms. Yet, even in this artificial environment, winter made itself felt. The Executor operated across the galaxy, and during winter months, it would often be deployed to systems celebrating seasonal festivals. Shore leave was granted when operational security allowed, and crew members would return from planetary visits carrying evidence of celebrations, special foods, small decorations, gifts exchanged with locals during traditional festivals. The Empire officially discouraged such fraternization, viewing it as a potential security risk and a distraction from duty. But completely preventing it was impossible without destroying morale, so it was tolerated within limits. Crew members were allowed to maintain small personal effects in their quarters. Common areas could be decorated modestly during recognized imperial holidays. And during winter months, when much of the galaxy celebrated year-end festivals, the ship's command structure looked the other way as crew members found small ways to mark the occasions. Vader observed all of this from his position of absolute authority and absolute isolation. He moved through the Executor like a ghost, his presence clearing corridors, his approach announced by the mechanical rhythm of his breathing, his reputation ensuring that anyone who encountered him was professionally focused and personally terrified. The crew quarters on the Executor ranged from cramped bunk rooms for junior enlisted personnel to relatively spacious cabins for senior officers. Vader's quarters were among the largest on the ship, but describing them as quarters was misleading. They were more accurately described as a life support facility with attached meditation chamber. The meditation sphere was the center of his living space. Here, suspended in hyperbaric pressure controlled by sophisticated atmospheric processors, Vader could remove his helmet and mask. The chamber was lined with dark metal, inscribed with Sith runes that served both decorative and functional purposes. The air inside was kept at specific temperature, pressure, and gas mixture optimized for his damaged respiratory system. Outside this sphere was the larger chamber where Vader existed while suited. Stark, functional, devoid of personal effects or decoration beyond the practical, medical equipment for suit maintenance, communication systems for fleet command, displays showing tactical information and intelligence reports. Everything designed for purpose, nothing included for comfort. There were no windows. Vader had no interest in views of stars or planets. The galaxy outside his ship was operational space to be controlled, not scenery to be appreciated. His connection to his environment came through the Force and through his command systems, not through visual contemplation. During winter seasons, when much of the crew was subtly celebrating in whatever small ways they could manage, Vader would retreat to his quarters more often than usual, not to celebrate, not to mark the occasions in any meaningful way, but to escape the emotional noise of thousands of beings simultaneously experiencing hope, joy, and connection. The Force carried emotion like a current. Vader was constantly aware of the feelings of those around him, particularly strong emotions like the anticipation and happiness that accompanied celebrations. Most of the time, this awareness was background noise, easily filtered. But during winter festivals, when celebration was widespread and concentrated, the emotional resonance became harder to ignore. He found it disturbing on multiple levels. The joy of others reminded him of his own lack of joy, his inability to experience positive emotions in any uncorrupted form. Their anticipation of celebration with family and friends highlighted his isolation. Their hope for the future contrasted sharply with his certainty that his future held only continued service to the Emperor and eventual death with no meaning beyond the fear he had inspired. But perhaps most disturbing was the echo response he felt within himself. Some buried part of Anakin Skywalker remembered what it felt like to anticipate celebration, remembered gathering with Jedi during winter festivals at the temple, remembered flying to Naboo to spend the Festival of Light with Padme, and that part of him, though buried beneath layers of darkness and suffering, responded to the celebratory emotions around him with a longing so profound it physically hurt. Vader suppressed this response ruthlessly. He would retreat to his meditation sphere, remove his helmet in the privacy of pressurized isolation, and spend hours in deep meditation. Not peaceful meditation seeking balance or enlightenment. Dark side meditation, feeding his anger and pain, deliberately stoking the darkness within himself to burn away any trace of that unwelcome longing. The process was exhausting. Maintaining the level of darkness required to suppress his remaining humanity demanded constant effort. The dark side was powerful, but it was not self-sustaining. It required fuel, anger, hatred, fear, suffering. And while Vader had more than enough of those emotions, transforming them into usable power while simultaneously using that power to suppress other emotions created a feedback loop that drained him. On one particular winter night, 4 years after the Battle of Hoth, Vader sat in his meditation sphere and felt the weight of his isolation more heavily than usual. The executor was in orbit around Botawui, and the crew had been granted limited shore leave to celebrate the local winter festival. Hundreds of crew members had shuttled down to the planet's capital, returning with gifts and festival foods that they shared with those who had remained aboard. The emotional resonance was strong enough that even Vader's shields could not completely block it. He felt their happiness like static on his senses, irritating and inescapable. More disturbing, he caught fragments of their thoughts as they celebrated, mental snippets of families missed and messages sent home, memories of past celebrations with loved ones, hopes that next year they might receive postings closer to their home systems. These were his subordinates, his crew, beings who existed to serve his will and execute his orders. They were tools, nothing more. Their personal lives were irrelevant to him except as they affected their performance of duty. This was what Vader told himself, what he needed to believe to maintain the psychological distance required for his role as enforcer. But he could not entirely suppress his awareness of them as beings rather than tools. They had lives beyond their service, families who loved them, hopes and dreams that had nothing to do with the Empire or its goals. They were not so different from the man Anakin Skywalker had been, people trying to find meaning and connection in a vast and often hostile galaxy. The recognition disturbed him because it implied a responsibility he had long since rejected. If they were beings rather than tools, then he bore some responsibility for their well-being beyond mere operational efficiency. If they had hopes and dreams, then crushing those hopes through his actions had moral weight beyond tactical considerations. Vader could not accept such responsibility. To do so would be to acknowledge that his service to the Empire caused suffering that was his personal fault, not just an impersonal consequence of necessary order. He would have to face the reality that he had become exactly the sort of oppressor he had once despised, that the slave boy from Tatooine who had dreamed of freeing slaves had become the master who kept billions enslaved. The thought provoked rage, not righteous anger at injustice, but defensive fury at being forced to confront uncomfortable truth. Vader channeled that rage into the Force, letting it flow through him and out into the meditation chamber. Dark side energy crackled across the inscribed runes, creating patterns of shadow and dim light. The temperature inside the sphere dropped several degrees as the anger consumed available energy, and then gradually the rage subsided. Not because Vader had resolved the conflict, but because he had exhausted himself emotionally. He sat in the aftermath of his fury, breathing the specialized atmosphere, and felt nothing. Not happiness, not sadness, just emptiness, just cold. This was the reality of his existence, endless cycles of confronting unwelcome emotion, transforming it into dark side power, and then collapsing into numbness until the next emotional stimulus triggered the cycle again. There was no peace, no resolution, only endurance. Outside his meditation sphere, the executor continued its operations. Crew members celebrated quietly in common areas, careful not to be too obvious or too loud. Officers maintained watch on the bridge, monitoring systems and communications. Stormtroopers stood guard at critical points throughout the ship. The machine of imperial military power functioned smoothly, indifferent to the season or the celebrations. And at the center of this massive vessel, in his isolated sphere of life support, Darth Vader sat alone, master of the ship, but connected to no one aboard it, commanding absolute obedience, but receiving no genuine respect or loyalty, powerful beyond measure, but unable to experience the simple joy that even the lowest-ranked crew member could access during winter celebrations. The irony was not lost on him. He had chosen power over connection, had embraced the dark side to gain strength that might have saved Padme, had accepted Palpatine's promises of control over life and death itself. And what had it given him? Power, yes. Fear from all who encountered him, certainly. But also isolation so complete that he existed apart from the living galaxy, a dead thing animated by hatred and machinery, unable to truly connect with any being beyond the bond of master and servant that tied him to the Emperor. The Festival of Stars, as the crew called the winter celebration happening on Bothawui below, would last for 3 more days. The executor would remain in orbit for that entire period, providing security and maintaining imperial presence. And for those 3 days, Vader would retreat to his quarters when not actively required on the bridge, spending hours in meditation, listening through the Force to the emotional resonance of celebration he could not share. He told himself this was duty, that he was maintaining vigilance while others celebrated, that his isolation was the price of command, the necessary distance between leader and led. These were lies, but they were comfortable lies, easier to accept than the truth that he was alone because he had destroyed every relationship he had ever valued, that his isolation was self-imposed even if it felt like external prison. On the 3rd and final night of the Festival of Stars, a malfunction occurred in one of the crew recreation areas. A power coupling had failed, causing a small electrical fire that was quickly contained by automatic suppression systems. No one was injured, minimal damage was done, but protocol required that Vader be informed of any shipboard incidents, regardless of severity. He had received the report while in his quarters, his helmet removed, breathing in the controlled environment of his meditation sphere. The report had been delivered by Admiral Piet via communication system, the Admiral's voice filtered through speakers with appropriate respect and formality. Vader had acknowledged the report, confirmed that repairs were underway, and prepared to return to his meditation. But something had made him pause. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps some fragment of Anakin still capable of human interest. Whatever the reason, Vader had queried the ship's internal surveillance system, calling up visual feeds from the affected recreation area. The room had been decorated modestly for the Festival of Stars. Small paper stars hung from ceiling fixtures. A few strings of colored lights draped the walls. Someone had even crafted a makeshift tree from maintenance materials, decorating it with improvised ornaments made from spare parts and recycled materials. The crew members in the room when the fire had started had responded professionally. They had evacuated quickly, activated suppression systems, and waited for all clear before returning. Now they were back in the room, cleaning up minor fire damage and discussing whether they should continue their celebration or call it ended. Vader had watched them through the surveillance feed, these beings whose names he did not know and whose individual lives meant nothing to him. They had decided to continue. Someone made a joke about the fire being part of the celebration, traditional Festival of Stars fireworks brought indoors. Others had laughed. They had resumed their gathering, a little more subdued, but still determined to mark the occasion. And watching them, Vader had felt something unexpected. Not quite envy, not quite longing, but an acknowledgement of what they possessed that he lacked. They had each other. They had the ability to find joy even in difficult circumstances. They could laugh at danger, continue celebrations despite setbacks, maintain hope that the future might be better than the present. He had none of these things. His power isolated him absolutely. His darkness precluded joy. His past destroyed hope for any better future. He existed in eternal winter while they briefly touched spring. Vader had closed the surveillance feed and returned to his meditation. The observation had meant nothing, changed nothing, revealed nothing he had not already known, but it had reinforced the reality of his existence with particular clarity. The silent nights aboard the Executor continued, winter after winter, year after year. The crew celebrated when circumstances allowed. Shore leave was granted and enjoyed. Small traditions were maintained in common areas and personal quarters. And through it all, Vader remained apart, separate, alone. The dark side promised power, but delivered isolation. It offered strength, but required the sacrifice of connection. And Vader, having made that bargain long ago, could only endure the consequences of his choice, watching from his isolated position as others experienced the warmth he had given up to gain the cold power that now defined his existence. Winter aboard the Executor was eternal, and the Dark Lord who commanded the vessel was its living embodiment, cold, isolated, and enduring without end. The Emperor's winter demands. The Emperor's throne room in the Imperial Palace was kept deliberately cold. This was not an accident of climate control or a failure of heating systems. It was intentional, designed to create discomfort in all who attended Palpatine in his seat of power. The chill served multiple purposes. It kept visitors off balance. It reminded them that the Emperor's comfort took precedence over theirs, and it created an environment where only the strong-willed could maintain focus during extended audiences. For Darth Vader, the cold meant nothing physically. His suit regulated its own temperature, and what remained of his biological body had long since lost most capacity to register external conditions. But he understood the psychological purpose of the chill, and he recognized that the Emperor was particularly fond of summoning him to the throne room during the winter months when the symbolic resonance was strongest. Winter, 5 years into the Empire's reign, Vader had been recalled from a campaign against rebel cells in the Arcanis sector. The operation had been proceeding successfully, with Imperial forces systematically eliminating resistance nodes and capturing rebel supply caches. There was no operational reason for Vader to abandon the campaign, but the Emperor had summoned him, and when Palpatine called, Vader came. He had arrived at the Imperial Palace in the early hours of morning, Coruscant time. The planet's winter season was well underway, with designated celebration zones displaying their festival decorations. Even from the upper levels of the palace, Vader could see the lights of celebrations far below, tiny sparks of defiance against the darkness. The throne room guards had admitted him immediately. They always did. Vader required no appointments, no advance notice. He was the Emperor's enforcer, and his access to Palpatine was unrestricted by conventional protocol. Palpatine had been seated on his throne, his twisted form wrapped in dark robes, his face hidden partially in shadow. The Emperor preferred dim lighting, finding it suited his aesthetic and made his rare displays of Force lightning more visually impressive. "Lord Vader," Palpatine had said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber with surprising strength for such a withered body. "How good of you to accept my invitation." Invitation? As if Vader had a choice. As if summoning the apprentice was anything other than a command to be obeyed. But Palpatine enjoyed these pretenses of courtesy, this facade that their relationship was partnership rather than domination. "Master," Vader had responded, bowing formally. "I am always at your service." "Yes, yes, you are." Palpatine had risen from his throne, moving with the shuffling gait of his aged form. "Come, walk with me. There is much we must discuss." They had left the throne room and moved through the palace corridors. This was Palpatine's preferred method for important conversations, walking through empty halls where no one could overhear, where the Emperor's words were for Vader alone. It also served to demonstrate Palpatine's stamina, his ability to walk for extended periods despite his apparent frailty, a subtle reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The winter celebrations, Palpatine had begun his tone conversational. They continue across the galaxy despite our best efforts to channel them toward more productive expressions. The populace clings to their traditions, Lord Vader. Why did you suppose that is? It was the sort of question that had no correct answer, only answers that pleased or displeased the Emperor. Vader had learned to navigate such conversational traps over years of service. "They find comfort in tradition, Master. The celebrations provide psychological stability in times of change." Perhaps. Or perhaps they use celebration as cover for rebellion. Gatherings become opportunities to organize resistance. Festival communications provide channels for seditious messaging. What appears to be innocent cultural expression may hide darker purposes. If you believe the celebrations are being used against imperial interests, I can increase monitoring and enforcement. No, Palpatine had waved dismissively. Direct suppression would create martyrs and fuel actual rebellion. We must be more subtle. We must corrupt the celebrations from within, transform them into tools that serve us rather than threaten us. They had walked in silence for a time, their footsteps echoing in empty corridors. Through the massive windows, Coruscant's cityscape was visible, lights stretching to every horizon. Palpatine had paused at one such window, looking out over his domain. "You find the winter celebrations difficult, don't you, Lord Vader?" The question had caught Vader off guard. Palpatine rarely acknowledged Vader's emotional struggles directly, preferring to manipulate through suggestion rather than confrontation. "I find them irrelevant to imperial objectives, Master." "That is not what I asked." Palpatine had turned to face him, yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You suffer during these seasons. The celebrations remind you of what you have lost, of Padme." The name hung in the air between them, rarely spoken but always present. Vader had remained silent, uncertain what response Palpatine was seeking. "She loved the festivals, did she not?" Palpatine had continued, his voice gentle, almost sympathetic. "The Festival of Light, particularly. Naboo traditions held special meaning for her, and you shared that with her. You participated in their celebrations despite your Jedi training forbidding such attachments. You allowed yourself to hope for a future that could never be. The past is dead, Master, as you have taught me." "The past is never entirely dead, my friend. It lives in memory, and memory has power. The Jedi taught that attachment was weakness, that emotion was to be suppressed, but we know better, don't we? Emotion is strength. Pain is power, and your pain over Padme's death makes you strong." Vader had sensed the manipulation in Palpatine's words, but that did not make them less effective. The Emperor was a master at finding psychological pressure points and applying force with surgical precision. Your suffering serves the dark side, Palpatine had continued. Every winter, every celebration, every reminder of what you lost feeds your anger and strengthens your connection to true power. This is why I summoned you to Coruscant during these seasons. Not to torture you, but to ensure you do not forget, to prevent you from finding peace that would weaken you. I have not forgotten, Master. No, but you are tempted to do so, aren't you? When you are away on campaigns, focused on immediate objectives, the past grows distant. You become merely the Emperor's enforcer, executing orders without emotional investment. This is insufficient. I need you angry, Lord Vader. I need you in pain, because pain transforms you from a mere servant into a weapon of exquisite precision. The honesty was startling. Palpatine rarely admitted his manipulation so directly, but perhaps that was part of the manipulation itself. By acknowledging what he was doing, by making it explicit, the Emperor demonstrated his complete control over their relationship. He could twist the psychological knife openly because Vader had no choice but to accept it. The rebel leadership, Palpatine had said, changing subjects with practiced ease, they have been particularly active this winter season. Intelligence suggests they are using the cover of planetary celebrations to move supplies and personnel. Mon Mothma has been seen on Chandrila, supposedly visiting family during the Festival of Stars. Bail Organa remains on Alderaan, hosting traditional winter gatherings that likely serve as rebel strategy sessions, and various other senators and officials use the season as excuse for activities we cannot directly prove are treasonous. Give me their names, Master. I will deal with them. Patience. We must be careful with senators, particularly those from core worlds with strong loyalties. Direct action against them would create political complications, but there are others, less protected, who deserve your attention. Palpatine had provided Vader with a list of targets: minor rebel operatives, celebration organizers who had been identified as resistance sympathizers, cultural leaders whose influence made them dangerous to imperial control. None were senators or major political figures. All were expendable from a political perspective, but valuable as examples. I want them eliminated during the celebrations, Palpatine had instructed. I want the festivities disrupted in ways that make clear no one is safe, no occasion too sacred for imperial justice. And I want you to conduct these operations personally, Lord Vader. I want you present during their most joyous moments to remind them of the consequences of defiance. It was a mission designed to maximize psychological impact and personal suffering. Vader would have to infiltrate celebrations, identify targets, and eliminate them in contexts designed for happiness and connection. He would become the manifestation of winter's darkest qualities: the cold that kills, the darkness that devours light, the death that interrupts life. It will be done, Master. Good, good. Palpatine had smiled, a terrible expression of satisfaction. And Lord Vader, remember that in destroying their celebrations, you honor Padme's memory in the only way that remains to you. She would want you to be strong, to embrace the power that could have saved her if you had accepted it sooner. Every rebel you kill, every celebration you disrupt, you do in her name. This is your tribute to her love. The perversity of the statement was breathtaking, transforming Vader's love for Padme into justification for spreading suffering, making his greatest loss the reason for causing others similar loss. It was manipulation at its most refined, and Vader recognized it for what it was. But recognition did not grant immunity. Palpatine's words still found their targets, still twisted meaning and corrupted memory. Because if Vader accepted that his actions as the Emperor's enforcer honored Padme's memory, if he convinced himself that the power he wielded served some higher purpose related to his love for her, then he could bear the weight of his crimes more easily. He could transform guilt into righteousness, suffering into strength. Vader had accepted the mission and departed Coruscant that same day. He spent the next 3 months executing Palpatine's orders with ruthless efficiency. Celebration organizers on a dozen worlds found themselves facing the Dark Lord during the most joyous occasions. Festival gatherings were interrupted by imperial raids. Cultural leaders were arrested or eliminated in ways that made clear the Empire's reach was absolute. Each operation reinforced the lesson Palpatine wanted taught. There is no refuge from imperial power, no occasion sacred enough to provide sanctuary, no celebration joyous enough to keep the darkness at bay. And at the center of each operation was Vader, the physical embodiment of that darkness, the living reminder that winter's cold could reach anywhere. The pattern repeated year after year. As each winter season approached, Palpatine would summon Vader to Coruscant. They would walk through palace corridors while the Emperor dispensed wisdom that was really manipulation, compassion that was really cruelty, truth that was really poison. And Vader would accept it all because he had no alternative, because his choices had locked him into service with no escape except death. One particular winter summons came 7 years after the Battle of Yavin, 1 year after the disaster at Hoth. The Emperor had been displeased with the rebels' successful evacuation of their base, viewing it as a failure of Vader's leadership. The summons had come with edge of threat, a suggestion that continued failure would not be tolerated. Vader had arrived at the palace expecting punishment or demotion. Instead, he had found Palpatine in surprisingly good mood, almost cheerful in his terrible way. "Lord Vader," the Emperor had greeted him, "I have wonderful news. The Death Star is nearly complete. Soon we will have the power to crush the rebellion utterly, to destroy entire worlds that harbor dissent. The fearless weapon will eliminate any remaining resistance. Order will be absolute." The Death Star. Vader knew of the project, though he had not been intimately involved in its construction. A battle station capable of destroying planets, a weapon of terror designed to prevent rebellion through the threat of ultimate destruction. A powerful tool, Master. More than a tool, a symbol. The Death Star will demonstrate conclusively that any resistance to imperial authority is futile. One world destroyed will prevent millions of others from considering rebellion. It is elegant in its efficiency. Vader had felt conflicted about the weapon. On one hand, anything that could end the rebellion and bring stability to the galaxy served legitimate purpose. But on the other hand, the destruction of entire planets seemed excessive, even by the Empire's brutal standards. Billions of innocent beings would die for the crimes of their leadership, the young and old, the guilty and innocent, all equally destroyed. "You disapprove," Palpatine had observed, reading Vader's emotions through the Force. "I question the necessity of such extreme measures, Master. Terror can be effective, but it can also breed the very resistance it seeks to prevent." But this is not merely terror. This is demonstration of absolute power when Alderaan is destroyed. Alderaan, Vader had interrupted, surprised at the specificity. Yes, Alderaan, Senator Organa's precious peaceful world. It will serve as the first public demonstration of the Death Star's power. A core world, loyal in appearance but harboring rebel sympathies. Its destruction will send a message that nowhere is safe, no status provides protection. Even the most privileged worlds will fall if they oppose imperial authority. The plan disturbed Vader more than he wanted to acknowledge. Alderaan was one of the galaxy's cultural centers, a world of art and philosophy, relatively innocent compared to systems that had actively supported the Separatists or openly harbored rebels. Its destruction would be genocide on a scale unprecedented even in the brutal history of galactic warfare. Master, I recommend reconsidering the target. There are worlds far more deserving of such punishment. Systems that have openly defied imperial authority, that have provided material support to rebels. Alderaan, while suspicious, has maintained technical compliance with imperial law. Palpatine had studied Vader with those penetrating yellow eyes, seeming to look past the mask into the conflict within. You object because you knew Padme was close to Bail Organa, the Emperor had said, his voice soft but cutting. Because you remember attending celebrations at the Alderaanian palace with her, walking among their precious ice sculptures and listening to their philosophy of virtue. You retain sentimental attachment to a world that meant something to the woman you loved. I object on strategic grounds, Master. Destroying Alderaan risks creating martyrs and hardening moderate worlds against imperial authority. Your strategic assessment is noted and rejected. Alderaan will be destroyed because it represents everything the Old Republic valued: culture, peace, democracy. By destroying it, we destroy those ideals symbolically as well as literally. We prove that beauty and philosophy are worthless against raw power. This is precisely the lesson the galaxy needs to learn. There had been no room for further argument. Palpatine had decided, and Vader's role was to accept and obey. As with so many decisions, he was consulted after the fact, his opinion irrelevant to outcomes already determined. You will be present at the Death Star during its first operation, Palpatine had continued. Grand Moff Tarkin will command the station. But I want you there as my personal representative. I want you to witness the destruction of Alderaan. I want you to feel the deaths of billions through the Force. And I want you to understand that this is the power we wield, the authority we command. Sentiment has no place in our rule, Lord Vader. Not for Padme, not for Alderaan, not for anything that might make you weak. The mission had been another demonstration of Palpatine's psychological manipulation. By forcing Vader to witness Alderaan's destruction, the Emperor would further sever any remaining sentimental ties to the past. By making Vader complicit in the genocide through his presence and position, Palpatine would ensure that no path to redemption remained open. Each such action drove Vader deeper into darkness, made the possibility of return more remote. Vader had witnessed Alderaan's destruction as commanded. He had stood on the Death Star's bridge, feeling through the Force as billions of lives were suddenly silenced. The planet had come apart like glass shattering, its structure unable to withstand the energy directed at its core. What had been a beautiful world became debris field in seconds, an entire civilization erased as if it had never existed. The experience had been overwhelming, even hardened by years of killing, even transformed by the dark side. Vader had been unprepared for the psychic impact of planetary destruction. Billions of voices crying out simultaneously, then silence. The void left in the Force was palpable, a wound in the fabric of reality itself. And in that moment, Vader had understood the true depth of his enslavement to the Emperor. This was what he served. This was the empire he enforced. Not order or stability or even meaningful peace. Just raw power applied without restraint, destruction for the sake of demonstrating capacity for destruction. The winters that followed Alderaan's annihilation carried particular weight. The galaxy mourned, though that mourning had to be done in secret. The Empire forbade public commemoration of the destroyed world, declaring that any such memorial would be treated as sedition. But people remembered anyway. They marked the anniversary quietly. They told their children about the beautiful world that had been. They kept the memory alive despite the danger. And Vader, walking through the corridors of the Executor during these anniversary periods, could feel the suppressed grief and rage emanating from thousands of crew members who had known someone from Alderaan, who had visited the planet, who had been inspired by its culture. He had destroyed his own crew's morale through his complicity in the planet's annihilation, and there was nothing he could do to repair that damage. The Emperor's winter demands continued year after year, each one designed to push Vader further from any possibility of redemption, to ensure that his suffering remained fresh and his anger remained hot. Palpatine understood that Vader's power came from his pain, and the Emperor tended that pain like a gardener tending a particularly deadly plant, nurturing it to ensure maximum yield. Winter became synonymous with these summons, with missions designed to corrupt whatever remained of Vader's humanity. And Vader endured it because he saw no alternative, because the dark side had become his prison as much as his power, because the Emperor held him through bonds stronger than any physical chains could provide. The throne room remained cold. The winter celebrations continued across the galaxy, and Darth Vader, trapped between his master's demands and his own dying humanity, served as the instrument of darkness that turned light to shadow, joy to fear, hope to despair. Acts of hidden mercy. The holocron of Darth Vader would never speak of mercy. Imperial records contained no evidence that the Emperor's enforcer ever showed compassion to enemies or granted reprieve to those condemned by imperial justice. The official history portrayed Vader as an implacable force, a monster in black armor who executed the Emperor's will without hesitation or remorse. This was the public face, the reputation carefully cultivated and maintained, but reputation and reality are not always identical. And in the private moments of winter nights across the galaxy, in the shadows between official reports, Vader occasionally made choices that defied his image as pure instrument of destruction. Not often. Not in ways that would undermine his effectiveness or betray his master, but sometimes, in circumstances that would leave no official record, he allowed mercy to exist. These instances were not acts of kindness in any conventional sense. Vader did not help people because he felt compassion or believed they deserved salvation. Rather, he occasionally chose not to destroy when destruction was not absolutely necessary, allowed life to continue when death was not strategically required. It was the smallest possible deviation from absolute cruelty, the thinnest possible thread of humanity persisting beneath layers of darkness. The first instance that Vader consciously acknowledged came during a winter operation on Christophsis, a world known for its crystal formations and its strong cultural tradition of winter light festivals. The planet had been identified as harboring rebel sympathizers, and Vader had been dispatched to root out the resistance cell suspected of operating there. His investigation had led him to a family-run crystal merchant business in the capital city. Intelligence suggested the business was a front for rebel communications, using shipments of crystal to hide encoded messages and occasionally smuggling weapons or personnel hidden among legitimate cargo. Vader had arrived at the business during evening hours when the family would all be present. The Festival of Crystals was in full celebration, the city lit by thousands of lights refracted through natural crystal formations, creating rainbow displays across every surface. The beauty was undeniable, even to one as corrupted by darkness as Vader had become. The family had been at dinner when he entered, a father, mother, 2 children, and an elderly grandmother. They had frozen in terror at his appearance, knowing exactly who stood in their doorway and what his presence meant. Vader had confronted them directly. "You are suspected of providing material support to the rebellion. Imperial intelligence has identified this establishment as a communications node for terrorist activities. You will answer my questions truthfully, or you will be arrested and interrogated by less gentle methods." The father had stepped forward, placing himself between Vader and his family. With courage, Vader could not help but recognize, "Lord Vader, there has been a mistake. We are simple merchants. We sell crystal to buyers across the galaxy. If rebels have used our business without our knowledge, we cannot be held responsible for that." It was a lie. Vader could sense the man's fear and guilt through the Force, could feel the terror of the mother as she positioned herself in front of her children, could detect the defiance radiating from the grandmother despite her frail appearance. They were guilty. They had been supporting rebels, using their business exactly as intelligence had suggested. Protocol demanded immediate arrest. At minimum, detention and interrogation for the adults, placement of the children in imperial custody, seizure of the business, and all assets. Maximum penalty could include execution, particularly if interrogation revealed the extent of their rebel connections. But as Vader had stood there, looking at this family gathered for their winter meal, something had stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of other families he had destroyed. Perhaps it was the sight of the children, innocent regardless of their parents' choices, facing death through no fault of their own. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion with the endless cycle of destruction. "What crystal varieties do you stock?" Vader had asked, his question unexpected enough that the father had hesitated before answering. "Many types, Lord Vader, focusing crystals, decorative specimens, industrial-grade materials. We pride ourselves on quality and variety." "Show me." The command had confused them, but they had no choice except to comply. The father had led Vader through their showroom, displaying various crystal specimens, explaining their properties and uses with the knowledge of a genuine expert. The man clearly understood his product, was genuinely passionate about the unique qualities of Christophsis crystals. Vader had listened, asking occasional questions, examining certain specimens more closely. And through this mundane conversation about minerals and commerce, he had gathered the information he actually sought. The family was indeed supporting rebels, but their involvement was limited. They passed messages and provided occasional safe harbor for rebel agents traveling through the system. They had never handled weapons, never participated in violence, never done more than offer the small resistance available to civilians trapped in circumstances beyond their control. They were guilty, but their guilt was minor. They deserved punishment by imperial law, but not death, not destruction of their entire family and livelihood. Vader had purchased several crystal specimens, paying from discretionary funds available to him for operational expenses. The father had wrapped them carefully, his hand shaking, clearly uncertain what was happening or why. "Your business serves a useful purpose," Vader had said when the transaction was complete. "Christophsis crystals are valuable to the Empire. I will note in my report that this establishment is a loyal Imperial supplier and should be protected from rebel interference. However," he had leaned closer, his voice dropping to menacing whisper, "if I ever have reason to return here, if your business is again connected to rebel activities, I will not be so generous. Do you understand?" "Yes, Lord Vader," the father had managed to say. "Thank you, Lord Vader." Vader had left without further comment. His official report classified the intelligence about the business as false, a case of mistaken identity or faulty information. The family was cleared of suspicion. The business continued operating, and rebel communications through that node ceased immediately. The family, too terrified of discovery to risk further involvement. It was not mercy in any noble sense. Vader had threatened the family, terrified the children, bought compliance with fear. But he had also chosen not to destroy when destruction would have been easy and justified by imperial law. He had allowed them to live when he could have killed them. And that choice, however small, however motivated by pragmatism rather than compassion, represented a deviation from the absolute darkness he believed he had become. Other instances followed over the years, always during winter months, when something about the celebratory atmosphere seemed to pull at whatever remained of Anakin Skywalker buried within Vader's armored shell. A musician on Alderaan who had written songs with rebel sympathies, Vader had demanded the musician destroy all copies of the offending work, but had not arrested him, allowing talent to survive when it could have been eliminated. A child on Corellia who had thrown a rock at Vader's shuttle during a winter demonstration, Vader had used the Force to deflect the rock and continued walking, ignoring an act that could have justified lethal response. A grandmother on Chandrila who had cursed at him during a Festival of Stars raid, calling him a monster who destroyed families. Vader had force-choked her into unconsciousness, but released before death, leaving her alive, though terrified. None of these actions constituted redemption. They did not balance the scale against the countless lives Vader had taken, the suffering he had caused, the terror he had spread. They were merely moments where he chose slightly less evil from among available options, where some faint echo of the person he had been managed to influence the monster he had become. The most significant instance came during the winter season following the Battle of Hoth, on a mission that would haunt Vader for years afterward. He had been hunting a Jedi survivor, a former Padawan named Sarah Keto, who had escaped Order 66 and been living in hiding on the Outer Rim. Sarah had been young when the Empire rose, barely knighted when Vader had led the assault on the Jedi Temple. She had survived by hiding her connection to the Force, living as a simple farmer on an agricultural world, trying to forget the life she had once known. But imperial inquisitors had eventually tracked her down, and Vader had come to finish what Order 66 had started. He had found her during the local Winter Harvest Festival, a celebration marking the end of the growing season and the beginning of winter. The farming community had gathered to share food and mark the occasion, and Sarah had been among them, indistinguishable from the civilians around her. Vader had identified her through the Force, sensing the suppressed power she tried desperately to hide. He had approached during the height of the festivities, his arrival ending celebration as efficiently as darkness ending light. "You are the Jedi Sarah Keto," Vader had stated, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Come forward, or these people will suffer for harboring you." Sarah had emerged from the crowd, her expression resigned. She had known this day would come eventually, that hiding could not last forever. But she had hoped, as all hunted beings hope, that somehow she might be overlooked, that she might live out her life in peace. "These people don't know what I am," she had said, her voice steady despite obvious fear. "They've done nothing wrong. Let them go. I'll come with you quietly." "You're in no position to negotiate, Jedi. Surrender your weapon and prepare for transport to Imperial custody." Sarah had not been carrying a lightsaber. She had destroyed it years ago, recognizing it as liability rather than asset in a galaxy where Jedi were hunted to extinction. She had raised her empty hands, demonstrating she posed no immediate threat. And then one of the farmers, an older man who had clearly befriended Sarah during her time in the community, had stepped forward. "She's done nothing but help us. She's worked harder than anyone, never complained, never caused trouble. Whatever she is, whatever you think she's done, she doesn't deserve to be taken by the Empire." Other villagers had murmured agreement, a dangerous show of solidarity. Vader had recognized the situation's volatility. These were civilians, likely unarmed, definitely untrained. But they outnumbered his small escort of stormtroopers significantly. If they chose to resist, suppressing them would require violence that would destroy the community and accomplish nothing except creating martyrs. "You do not understand what you are protecting," Vader had said, addressing the crowd. "This woman is not a farmer. She is a Jedi, trained in powers beyond your comprehension. The Jedi Order attempted to overthrow the legitimate government of the Republic. They were traitors who sought to impose their will on the galaxy. Those who survived Order 66 remain enemies of peace and stability. By harboring her, knowingly or not, you have violated Imperial law." "Then we're all guilty," the old farmer had declared with foolish courage. "Take us all if you must, but we won't let you take her without standing witness to the injustice." It was a moment of choice. Vader could massacre the entire community, could call in orbital support and level the settlement, could make an example that would be remembered across the sector as warning about the consequences of protecting Jedi. The Emperor would approve such action, would commend Vader for his ruthlessness and dedication to eliminating any trace of the Order that had once stood against Sith dominion. But standing there, surrounded by farmers who had chosen solidarity over self-preservation, facing a former Jedi who had lived peacefully for years rather than fighting the Empire, Vader had felt the weight of his actions in a way he rarely allowed himself to experience. Sarah Keto had not been leading a rebellion, had not been gathering followers or plotting against the Empire. She had simply been living, trying to survive, seeking nothing more than peace after years of war and persecution. And these farmers, simple people with no political sophistication, had recognized her fundamental decency and chosen to defend her despite the danger. They were everything the Jedi had claimed to serve, ordinary beings trying to live good lives, showing courage and compassion despite their lack of power. They would die for these virtues if Vader chose to kill them, and their deaths would accomplish nothing except adding more bodies to the mountain of corpses he had already created. Sarah Keto, Vader had said, his decision made, you are under imperial arrest. However, evidence suggests you have lived in compliance with imperial law during your time here, engaging in productive civilian activity rather than anti-imperial terrorism. Therefore, you will be transported to Coruscant for evaluation rather than summary execution. If you cooperate fully, if you provide intelligence on any surviving Jedi and assist Imperial Inquisitors in their work, you may earn clemency. It was a lie. Sarah would never be granted clemency. At best, she would be turned, corrupted into an Inquisitor herself, forced to hunt her former comrades. At worst, she would be interrogated and executed. But the lie allowed Vader to take her into custody without slaughtering the entire village to accomplish it. As for you, he had continued, addressing the assembled farmers, your ignorance of this woman's true identity will be noted in my report. However, Imperial authorities will be monitoring this settlement going forward. Any further harboring of fugitives will result in severe consequences. Return to your homes. This matter is concluded. The stormtroopers had taken Sarah into custody, Vader had departed with his prisoner, and the farming community had survived, forever changed by their encounter with the Emperor's enforcer, but alive to continue their lives. Sarah had remained silent during transport to Vader's shuttle, but as they had prepared to depart the planet, she had spoken, her voice soft but clear despite her restraints. Thank you for sparing them. I spared no one, Vader had replied coldly. I simply chose the most efficient method of securing your cooperation. Their lives mean nothing to me. Perhaps, but you could have killed them easily. That you chose not to suggests that somewhere beneath that armor, some part of the Jedi Anakin Skywalker still exists. The name had struck Vader like physical blow. None addressed him by that name. To everyone in the galaxy, Anakin Skywalker was dead, killed by Darth Vader, or simply erased from existence, depending on which version of history one believed. Hearing it spoken by someone who had actually known him, who had seen him during his Jedi years, brought memories flooding back with painful clarity. Anakin Skywalker is dead, Vader had said, his voice harsher than intended. I destroyed him as I will destroy you if you speak that name again. Yes, Lord Vader, Sarah had acquiesced, recognizing she had pushed too far. But the damage was done. The name had been spoken, the connection acknowledged. And for the rest of that journey back to Coruscant, Vader had wrestled with uncomfortable questions about why he had spared the farming community, whether his decision had truly been tactical efficiency or something else, something he could not afford to acknowledge without risking everything he had become. Sarah Keto had eventually been transformed into an inquisitor through methods that broke her will and corrupted her connection to the Force. Vader had overseen parts of her training, ensuring she became a useful tool for the Empire. And through it all, he had never forgotten her words, the suggestion that some part of Anakin survived within Vader's shell. These acts of hidden mercy, scattered across years of service to the Emperor, were Vader's secret rebellion. Not rebellion against the Empire or Palpatine's rule, but rebellion against his own complete corruption, small acts of resistance against the total darkness he believed he had embraced. They accomplished little in the grand scheme of galactic oppression. They saved some lives while countless others were destroyed. They represented the smallest possible deviation from absolute evil. But they existed, and their existence proved that transformation, even one as complete as Anakin's fall to Vader, was not entirely absolute. That somewhere beneath the armor and darkness and decades of horror, some tiny spark of light persisted, not enough to redeem, not enough to matter in any objective sense, but enough to prove that the man who had once been Anakin Skywalker, who had loved Padme and dreamed of better futures, was not completely dead, merely buried alive, screaming in darkness, occasionally capable of one small choice that deviated from the nightmare he had become. The Winter Lord's legacy. The Imperial Historical Society would record Darth Vader's campaigns with clinical precision. Battle statistics, strategic assessments, evaluation of tactical decisions. Historians would analyze his methods, study his effectiveness, debate his impact on Imperial military doctrine. But these official records would miss the deeper truth about Vader's legacy, particularly regarding his operations during winter months across the decades of his service. Vader became legend not through official documentation, but through whispered stories in dark corners of the galaxy. Tales told by survivors, by witnesses who had seen him in action, by beings who had felt his presence and lived to speak of it. And these stories, particularly those from winter campaigns, transformed Vader from mere Imperial enforcer into something approaching mythological status. They called him the Winter Lord, though never in his presence. The name spread through rebel cells and civilian populations in worlds that had experienced Vader's attention during winter festivals. It referenced not just the cold efficiency of his methods, but the way he seemed to embody winter's harshest qualities. The killing frost that spared nothing, the endless night that consumed light, the deep cold that penetrated every defense and left only death in its wake. The Battle of Hoth became the defining example of this mythology, Vader tracking rebels across ice and snow, relentless as a blizzard, implacable as winter itself. But 100 smaller incidents contributed to the legend. Vader arriving at celebrations to disrupt them with arrests and intimidation. Vader hunting Jedi survivors through winter storms on remote worlds. Vader standing in the ruins of bases destroyed during the winter months, a figure of death surrounded by white snow turned red with blood. One particular story gained widespread circulation among rebel forces, told and retold until it became more legend than history. A rebel cell on Ordo had planned a supply transfer during the world's winter solstice festival, hoping the celebrations would provide cover for their activities. But Vader had anticipated this, had positioned imperial forces to intercept the transfer at the moment of maximum vulnerability. According to the story, Vader had appeared during the height of the festival, emerging from a blizzard like a demon manifest. The rebels had fought desperately, but their weapons had been useless against him. He had deflected blaster fire with casual gestures, crushed resistance with applications of force power that seemed to have no limit. And when the battle ended, when the rebels lay dead or captured in the snow, Vader had stood alone in the center of the festival grounds, surrounded by the carnage he had created. The locals had watched from hiding, too terrified to flee or intervene. And in that moment, as wind howled and snow fell, one child had broken from her family's hiding place and walked toward Vader, just a little girl, no more than 6 standard years, approaching the monster that had destroyed the celebration and killed people she might have known. Vader had looked down at this child, and everyone present had expected him to kill her, to eliminate this witness to imperial violence without hesitation or remorse. But he had not. He had simply stood there, looking at the child, looking at him, and then he had turned and walked away, disappearing back into the blizzard from which he had emerged. The story might be true, or it might be embellishment of something less dramatic. But it spread across rebel networks and civilian populations, becoming part of Vader's legend. The Winter Lord who killed without mercy but occasionally, inexplicably, spared the innocent. The monster who destroyed celebrations but sometimes left survivors to carry stories of his terrible power. Other stories followed similar patterns. Vader sparing a musician who played winter songs that reminded him of something from his past. Vader allowing a grandmother to curse him during a Festival of Stars raid without immediate retaliation. Vader purchasing crystal from merchants he could have simply arrested, paying rather than taken, as if commerce still mattered to one who commanded such power. None of these stories portrayed Vader as good or redeemed. They simply added complexity to his image, suggested that the monster might retain some fragment of humanity buried beneath the armor. And this complexity made him more frightening, not less. A completely predictable monster could be understood, planned for, defended against, but a monster that occasionally deviated from its nature, that sometimes allowed mercy where none was expected, that was terrifying in ways pure evil could never achieve. The Emperor understood the psychological dimension and quietly encouraged the mythology. Palpatine recognized that fear of Vader was more useful than simple hatred of him. A figure that inspired both terror and confused fascination, that seemed beyond normal categories of good and evil, that operated according to rules that could not quite be predicted. Such a figure was the perfect enforcer for an empire built on fear and uncertainty. But the legacy of the Winter Lord extended beyond imperial strategic interests. For those who had encountered Vader during winter months, particularly those who had survived such encounters, the experience left marks that never entirely faded, survivor's guilt certainly, post-traumatic responses that manifested in various ways, but also something more subtle, a permanent awareness of darkness, an understanding that evil was not abstract but concrete, that monsters were real and could arrive at any moment to destroy everything. One survivor, a former rebel who had escaped a winter raid that killed most of his cell, later wrote about his experience in journal entries that were recovered after his death. His words captured something essential about what it meant to face Vader during those cold months. He came during our midwinter gathering when we had dared to celebrate despite the war, when we had allowed ourselves to remember joy. The doors exploded inward, and there he stood, silhouetted against the snow outside, more darkness than man. His breathing was the only sound, mechanical and steady, like death keeping time. We fought, though we knew it was useless. We ran, though we knew we could not escape. And when it was over, when I alone had survived through luck or accident, or perhaps his casual mercy, I understood something I wish I had never learned, that winter will always come again, that darkness can arrive in any moment of light, that the cold touch of death is patient and will claim us all eventually. He taught me to fear winter. He taught me that celebration is hubris in the face of entropy. He taught me that the galaxy is darker than I ever imagined, and no amount of light can permanently dispel that darkness. This is his gift, his legacy, not just death, but the knowledge of death's inevitability. Not just fear, but the understanding that fear is the only appropriate response to a universe that contains beings like Darth Vader. This psychological impact rippled through generations. Children who had witnessed Vader during winter operations grew up with nightmares of the Winter Lord. They told their own children stories meant to warn and protect. Tales of the Dark Enforcer who came during celebrations to punish those who opposed the Empire, and these stories took on lives of their own, evolving and changing, becoming part of cultural memory in ways that transcended historical accuracy. On some worlds, Vader became a figure similar to ancient winter demons from pre-technological mythology, a being who represented winter's darkest aspects, who had to be appeased or avoided, whose appearance brought death and whose departure brought relief. Parents would warn misbehaving children that the Winter Lord might come if they were not good, using Vader's legend as tool for behavioral compliance. The irony was profound. Darth Vader, who had once been Anakin Skywalker, who had dreamed of heroism and salvation, who had fallen to darkness trying to prevent death, had become the thing that parents threatened their children with. His existence had transformed from aspiration to warning, from hero to villain, from light to the embodiment of winter's coldest cruelty. But there was another dimension to Vader's winter legacy, one that official records and survivor stories both missed. Among Force sensitives across the galaxy, particularly those few Jedi who survived the Purge and those Force-sensitive beings who never received formal training, there developed an awareness of Vader during winter months that transcended physical presence. The Force itself seemed to register Vader's winter operations, creating echoes that sensitive beings could detect even at vast distances. When Vader hunted on frozen worlds, when he disrupted winter celebrations, when he killed during seasons meant for life and renewal, the Force rippled with disturbance that manifested as a kind of spiritual winter felt by those connected to its flow. These sensitives reported similar experiences, dreams of cold and darkness, sensations of being hunted during winter nights, awareness of deaths occurring far away, but felt with intimacy that distance should have prevented. They described Vader not just as a physical being, but as a presence in the Force itself, a walking wound that the living Force could not heal, a manifestation of winter's killing cold translated into conscious form. One former Jedi, writing in code in a journal that would only be discovered decades later, described meditation during a winter evening when Vader had been hunting on a world 3-star systems away. I feel him in the Force like frost forming on glass. His presence is not absence of light, but active consumption of it, darkness that feeds on and extinguishes illumination. During winter months, when the natural world cycles toward death and dormancy, his presence intensifies. It is as if winter itself recognizes kinship with him, as if the cold that kills plants and slows life has found conscious expression in this being. I meditate and feel him hunting, relentless as winter storm, patient as ice forming on still water. The Jedi believed we could sense darkness and oppose it with light. But Vader is not darkness that light can illuminate. He is winter that light cannot warm. He is the cold that comes regardless of fire, that persists despite all resistance, that will endure until the last heat death of the universe. This is what Anakin Skywalker has become. This is the legacy of his fall, not a servant of darkness, but darkness itself given form and purpose. These Force-sensitive accounts painted a picture more disturbing than any physical description of Vader's winter operations. They suggested that his transformation was not merely personal corruption, but alteration of reality itself, that by falling so completely to the dark side, Vader had become something that violated the natural order, a presence that the Force itself struggled to accommodate. The winter celebrations continued across the galaxy despite Vader, or perhaps because of him. Beings needed light to defy darkness, needed joy to resist despair, needed connection to oppose isolation. The more the Empire tried to suppress or co-opt these celebrations, the more important they became as acts of spiritual resistance. And in this way, Vader's winter legacy became paradoxical. His presence at celebrations meant to spread fear and ensure compliance. Instead, reinforced the importance of celebration itself. His disruption of joy proved that joy was worth defending. His embodiment of winter's cruelty made spring's return more precious. He became, unintentionally, the darkness that defined light, by contrast, the cold that made warmth meaningful. Years later, after Vader's death and the Empire's fall, scholars would debate his psychological state during these winter operations. Some argued he was a conscious monster, fully aware of his cruelty and embracing it. Others suggested he was a tragic figure trapped by circumstance and unable to escape the darkness that consumed him. A few posited that his occasional acts of mercy during winter months suggested ongoing internal conflict, a war between Vader and Anakin that never entirely resolved until his final moments. The truth, as always, was more complex than any single theory could encompass. Vader was all of these things simultaneously: monster and victim, villain and tragedy, darkness incarnate, and being still capable of momentary light. His winter campaigns revealed this complexity more clearly than any other aspect of his service to the Empire, because winter is the season of death and renewal, endings and beginnings, cold that kills and cold that preserves. And Vader embodied all of winter's contradictions: the destroyer who occasionally spared, the monster who remembered humanity, the Winter Lord who brought death but could not entirely forget what it meant to live. His legacy would endure long after his physical death, would persist in stories and memories, would remain as warning and reminder that darkness is real, that monsters walk among us, that winter will always return, but also that even in deepest cold, even in longest night, some small spark of light can persist. That transformation, however complete it seems, may never be entirely total. That redemption, however unlikely, remains theoretically possible until the very last moment. The Winter Lord's legacy was ultimately a question more than an answer, a challenge to everyone who heard the stories and considered their implications. What happens when good falls to evil? Can such a fall ever be reversed? Is the capacity for mercy proof of humanity, or is humanity's persistence irrelevant in the face of overwhelming evil? These questions had no easy answers. And perhaps that was the final truth of Vader's winter legacy: not resolution or understanding, but permanent uncertainty. The knowledge that complexity exists even in greatest darkness, that simple categories of good and evil fail when confronted with reality's nuance, that the galaxy contains beings who defy easy judgment because they are simultaneously too evil to forgive and too tragic to condemn without qualification. Darth Vader, the Winter Lord, Lord of cold and darkness, would be remembered. His victims would never forget him. His survivors would carry his mark forever. His legend would grow and change across generations, become a mythology that transcended historical truth. And the galaxy would continue its eternal cycle of seasons: winter following summer, following winter, cold following warmth, following cold, death following life, following death, with Vader's memory serving as reminder that winter, however harsh, is natural part of that cycle. That cold serves purpose even in its cruelty. That darkness, terrible as it is, makes light meaningful by providing contrast. This was his legacy. This was what endured after the mechanical breathing ceased, after the armor became merely metal, after the man and monster both had passed beyond life into whatever awaited. The memory of winter personified, walking among the living, teaching through terror the value of light, warmth, and connection. Teaching, through negative example, that these things mattered precisely because they could be destroyed, that they were worth celebrating precisely because celebration required courage in a galaxy that contained beings like the Winter Lord. Winter would always return. Darkness would always threaten. Cold would always kill. But life would persist. Spring would follow winter, and beings would continue to celebrate despite and because of the horrors they had endured. This was the paradoxical gift of Vader's winter legacy, proof that even the darkest presence could not permanently extinguish the light, that even the coldest winter must eventually yield to spring, that even the most complete fall carried within it the seeds of eventual redemption. The Winter Lord was dead, but winter remained, and in remembering him, the galaxy learned to cherish warmth, protect light, and celebrate life with understanding of how fragile and precious these things truly were. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Darth Vader's darkest seasons, please subscribe to Sith Lore for more comprehensive explorations of the dark side's legacy. Like this video to support the channel, and share it with fellow Star Wars enthusiasts who appreciate thorough examinations of the galaxy far, far away. May the Force be with you always.